In the fall of 1994, a 52-year-old woman pulled into the driveway of her home in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and then turned her car off. As she sat there for a minute chatting with her daughter on the phone, she was suddenly startled by someone running up and knocking on her car window. When she turned to see who it was, she saw this big guy standing in her driveway who she didn't recognize. But when she rolled the window down just a couple of inches and this guy was able to explain why he was there, the woman relaxed, and then she got out of the car, she shut the door behind her, and she led this guy into her home. That man would later be dubbed the Bathroom Man, and he was there to do something horrific to that woman. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please bring the 5-star review button to the movies with you, but instead of giving them popcorn, give them butter-covered styrofoam. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was another beautiful day in late October 1994. The afternoon air was cool and the sky above the town of Voorhees was a soft, clear blue, dotted with fluffy white clouds. As 52-year-old Carol Newlander stepped out the door of Classic Cakes Bakery onto the sidewalk, she stopped for a minute and tilted her face upward to enjoy the feel of the light breeze and sunshine. With her eyes closed, she could forget for a few seconds that she was standing in a strip mall in northern New Jersey surrounded by parking lots, and that pretty soon she'd be joining the hundreds of other drivers on the crowded highway that led south from Voorhees to Carol's home in neighboring Cherry Hill. Carol let out her breath and opened her eyes. She and her husband, Rabbi Fred Newlander, did not actually mind the commercial sprawl that had spread out around them since they had arrived in Cherry Hill 20 years ago. That was when Fred had gotten his first job as assistant rabbi at a Jewish synagogue in Cherry Hill named Emmanuel Temple. A rabbi is a spiritual leader and religious teacher of a Jewish community or congregation. In the 2 decades since their arrival, as Cherry Hill's population grew, so had the Jewish community that now made up almost a third of Cherry Hill's 70,000 residents. Many in that community were ethnic Jews, people who can trace their ancestry back to the land of Israel, and others were non-ethnic Jews who had converted to Judaism. And just a few years after taking that job as assistant rabbi at Emmanuel Temple, Fred had gone on to found his own synagogue named Makor Shalom, which is Hebrew for source of peace. Central to Judaism is the belief in one God who revealed himself through ancient prophets. But Fred's new synagogue also focused on adapting the 3,800-year-old religion to the social and cultural conditions of the modern world. And Fred's gamble had paid off big time. By 1994, Makor Shalom had grown from a few families meeting in members' houses into the largest Jewish temple in Cherry Hill, with a congregation of almost 4,000 members. And Fred and Carol had moved from their small apartment to a comfortable 4-bedroom colonial house in one of the many subdivisions that had slowly but surely nibbled away at what had once been Cherry Hill's rolling farmland. But during those years, Fred was not the only one finding success. The last 2 decades had also been very good to Carol. She and Fred had had 1 daughter and 2 sons, and all 3 children were now either working or going to college or medical school. And 10 years ago, as Fred was busy building his congregation, Carol had decided to pursue her own dream. Working right out of her kitchen in their home at 204 Highgate Lane, Carol had poured her boundless energy into starting a business baking kosher cakes and selling them to local restaurants. With such a large Jewish community in Cherry Hill, Carol had recognized that there was an unmet demand among that group of customers for cakes and sweets that met strict Jewish dietary guidelines. And it would turn out the Gentile, non-Jewish residents of Cherry Hill were just as enthusiastic about Carol's cakes and cookies as the Jewish population was. So before long, what had started out as first Carol, then a handful of close friends making cakes in their ovens at home, had grown into Classic Cakes Company, with 2 large retail stores, one in nearby Audubon, and the other right there where Carol was standing, at the Eagle Plaza Shopping Center in Voorhees. Now, Classic Cakes employed close to 50 people, and combined sales from both bakeries easily topped $10,000 a day. And now, Carol thought to herself as she shouldered her purse and turned toward her own car out there in the parking lot, it was time to get on to the second half of her workday. It was Tuesday, October 25th, and on every Tuesday in the late afternoon, Carol and the other managers of Classic Cakes got together for their weekly business meeting in Cherry Hill, at the home of the company's director of human resources. It was a meeting that often lasted as long as 3 hours. But as Carol walked over to her dark Toyota Camry out in the strip mall parking lot, opening the car door and slipping into the driver's seat, that sense of peace she had felt when she had looked up at the sky a few minutes earlier had left her. In its place was a sense of uneasiness. It had to do with her husband, Fred, and the 6-month sabbatical that he had taken at the beginning of this year. A sabbatical is an extended paid leave period that gives an employee a chance to travel and study. And in Fred's case, the other staff at his synagogue had basically encouraged him to take this sabbatical, almost like it was a reward for all the hard work managing such a big congregation. And Fred had been excited about this sabbatical, but instead of using it to travel or study like most people do, Fred just used the time to grow out his thinning gray hair into a long ponytail, and then just kind of hung around the house in Cherry Hill and at his synagogue, Makor Shalom. Over the last 10 months, her husband had also become increasingly critical of his assistant rabbi, and to Carol, even after his sabbatical period had ended, Fred had seemed very distracted and preoccupied. Now, as Carol drove her car out of the Eagle Plaza parking lot and headed towards Route 70, she tried to reassure herself that Fred's change in behavior couldn't possibly have anything to do with their marriage. After all, they'd been together for almost 30 years, and during that time, Carol had come to know and cherish the qualities that made her and Fred such a strong couple. Where Fred was charismatic and bold, Carol was practical, warm, and good at listening to people. While Fred inspired people, Carol had a knack for making them feel like she was a trusted member of their family. And even though they had come from such different backgrounds, Carol and Fred had formed a loving and productive partnership. Carol, who had been born to wealthy parents, had grown up on the ocean side of New York in a big house with grounds that rolled down to the shore of Hewlett Bay. Fred, who was 1 year older than Carol, was the only child of immigrants who had grown up in the blue-collar section of Queens, New York, where his father had run a struggling dry cleaning business and his mother had stayed home to take care of Fred. Carol and Fred had met on a blind date when they were both in college. Fred was studying religion at Trinity University in Connecticut, and Carol was studying psychology at an exclusive women's college in Massachusetts. Carol, who was small and elegant with auburn-colored hair, intelligent dark eyes, and great taste in clothes and jewelry, was instantly attracted to Fred, whose physical strength and rugged good looks made him seem much taller than his 5 feet 4 inch tall frame. The attraction was 100% mutual. The two of them got married in 1965, moved to Queens, where Fred was later ordained as a rabbi, and by 1971, Cherry Hill, New Jersey would become the Newlanders' permanent home. And while Carol knew that the passage of the years and the daily routines of everyday life were bound to take the edge off the passion and romance that had brought her and Fred together 3 decades earlier, but she still felt that same attraction to Fred, and she knew that he felt the same way about her. Besides, in less than a week, they'd have some much-needed time to spend together when they headed up to New York this Saturday, October 29th, to visit some relatives. With this comforting thought in mind, Carol dragged her thoughts back to the work ahead of her. And by 4 p.m., after stopping on her way to run a couple of errands, Carol pulled into the driveway of the house where she would meet with her management team. A few hours later, Carol was once again back in her Toyota Camry, but even now her workday was not quite finished, because it had become Carol's habit that several days a week, she would take home that day's cash from both of her bakery branches, and then she would count the money right at her dining room table. Then, the next morning, she could just deposit the cash at the bank first thing. And while Carol thought this was an efficient and convenient way of doing things, Fred thought it was totally reckless, and he hated that she brought all that money home. Even though Carol kept telling Fred that no one outside of her management circle knew that she sometimes traveled with anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 in cash tucked into her burgundy wallet at the bottom of her handbag, Fred told her that all of her bakery employees must see her walk out of the store with all that cash, and so he thought Carol was just asking to get robbed. But Carol had always waved off his concerns, saying that her employees were highly vetted and would never do that to her. And where they lived, Cherry Hill, was known as a very safe and quiet neighborhood. And so Carol told Fred that, no one's ever going to break in and try to steal from them. After getting the cash from both of her bakery locations and hopping back into her car to make the ride back home, Carol glanced at her watch and saw that she still had time to call her 24-year-old daughter, Rebecca. Rebecca was married and a hospital administrator in Philadelphia. Carol had always been very close with Rebecca, and so she cherished these daily phone calls with her. So as Carol drove along, she picked up her car phone, she dialed Rebecca's number, and a few minutes later, she and her daughter were chatting happily about the day's events. Carol was still on the phone when she pulled into her driveway at 204 Highgate Lane. But before she could wrap up the call with Rebecca, Carol was suddenly startled by a loud knock on her car window right next to her head. After nearly dropping her phone, Carol turned and looked outside and saw this huge man standing there right in her driveway. Seeing the look of alarm on Carol's face, the stranger stepped back and put his hands up in the air reassuringly. Carol told Rebecca, who was now asking, what's going on, to just hang on for a minute, that someone was here, and then Carol rolled her window down just a few inches and asked what this guy wanted. And the man in the driveway apologized for startling Carol, and then told her he was just there to see the rabbi and to deliver a package to him. Instantly, Carol could feel herself relax. She had been a rabbi's wife long enough that she'd come to expect visits from members of his congregation for all kinds of reasons and at all kinds of hours, day and night. Rolling the car window down the rest of the way, Carol smiled at the visitor and gestured toward the darkened house. She told him that the rabbi was not home yet, but the man was welcome to come inside and wait and deliver the package in person. After hearing bits of this conversation her mother had just had with this unexpected visitor, Rebecca felt concerned, and when her mom put the phone back to her ear, Rebecca asked her to please give a call once this guy has left so Rebecca would know that her mom was okay. Carol agreed and then ended the call with Rebecca, and then Carol got out of her car, she shut the door behind her, and began walking toward her house with the visitor walking right behind her. Carol had left her handbag filled with all the money in her car trunk. She would come out later when her visitor had left to bring it inside. But for now, Carol led the way to the front door, and when she got there, she unlocked it and gestured for her visitor to step into the small, warm entrance. But once the visitor was inside, the man began acting strange, glancing quickly left and right at the living room and dining rooms on either side of him and Carol. Then he began shifting his weight from one foot to another, and then suddenly, kind of awkwardly, he blurted out to Carol, can I just use your bathroom for a minute? Sensing what she took to be his embarrassment at having to make this request, Carol just smiled and said, of course, and directed him through the kitchen to the first floor bathroom at the back of the house. And then Carol walked back to the front of the house. When the man returned a few minutes later, Carol was standing near the front door looking through the mail that had been delivered that day, and she told the visitor that he was welcome to take a seat in the living room. But the big man just thanked her, said he was sorry for bothering her, and just handed Carol a plain white envelope and asked if she could give it to the rabbi. And then the visitor reached his hand out to open the front door. Meanwhile, almost without thinking, Carol, who had been going through the mail, when she was handed this envelope, she just opened it right away. And when she saw its contents, which was nothing, it was an empty envelope, she put her hand out and stopped this guy and said, hey, wait a minute, it's empty. Did you give me the right one? The man looked startled and then told Carol he must have made a mistake and he picked up the wrong envelope earlier to bring by, and so he'd just have to come by another time. And then, without waiting to hear what Carol had to say, this man very quickly left the house and disappeared into the darkness. Back inside the house, Carol just tore up the empty envelope and dropped it into the wastebasket. Then she picked up the cordless landline phone and dialed Rebecca to tell her daughter that she didn't need to worry, that the man was gone. And as Carol told her daughter about this guy, she laughed and smiled to herself as she described how he came in and just used the bathroom, gave her an empty envelope, and then ran away. It was just another day in the life of a rabbi's wife. An odd but funny story that Carol would tell friends a couple of times in the following couple of days before forgetting all about it. But exactly 1 week later, both Carol and her daughter, Rebecca, would find themselves remembering that strange encounter all too well. Not long after 8 p.m. on the evening of Tuesday, November 1st, 1994, Carol was once again arriving at her home on Highgate Lane after having left the weekly Classic Cakes business meeting. The weekend trip she and Fred had just taken to New York had not gone at all the way Carol had hoped. And now, as she pulled her car into the driveway and looked at her darkened house, she told herself that the dissatisfaction that her husband had told her he felt in their marriage was just the result of a late midlife crisis. It had all come out during a big argument they had had on their way home from New York that past Sunday, and Carol was still feeling really hurt and angry. By Monday night, both Carol and Fred had calmed down and agreed that they would go to both separate and joint marriage counseling sessions. They had also talked to each other about cutting back on some of the activities that over the years had drawn them into almost separate lives: Fred's religious duties and Carol's business. But Carol was still upset and shaken, and as she parked her car, turned off the engine, grabbed her purse, and then walked through a swirl of fallen leaves to the house, all she wanted was to get inside and call her daughter Rebecca. Carol knew that hearing her daughter's voice, maybe planning a shopping trip together next weekend, would put Carol in a happier frame of mind. And sure enough, a few minutes later, when Carol heard her daughter pick up the phone and say hello, Carol's spirits lifted. With a sigh of relief, Carol kicked off her shoes in the front hall and then settled in for a nice long chat. But only partway through their call, at around 8:30 p.m., Carol was interrupted by a knock on the front door. Carrying the cordless phone with her, Carol walked to the entryway and peered out the big oval stained glass window in the center of the door. Even through the colored glass, Carol recognized her visitor right away. It was the same huge guy who had stopped by last Tuesday with the empty envelope. Carol swung the door open, and even before the man had time to say, "Hey, it's me again," Carol had invited him inside. She assumed that he was there to see the rabbi again, or maybe this time deliver an envelope that actually had something inside of it. As the man stepped inside, Carol very quietly whispered into the phone to her daughter that her visitor was the bathroom man again. Then Carol turned to her visitor and said she'd be off the phone in a minute, and for now he should just make himself comfortable in the living room. A minute later, Carol wrapped up her call with her daughter, and she put the cordless phone down on a wooden bench in the entryway. And then when she turned around, she was surprised to see her visitor, the bathroom man, had still not moved to the living room. He was still just standing right in front of the front door. Carol let out a quiet sigh, thinking to herself this man was still just as awkward now as he had been the last time they had met. But Carol's years of practice as a hostess kicked in, and she made herself smile. And stepping in front of her visitor, Carol invited the man to follow her deeper into the house. But Carol had only taken 1 or 2 steps away from him when she suddenly felt a big hand grab her left shoulder. And then, before Carol could turn around or even understand what was happening, she felt an explosion of pain as something smashed into the back of her head. The blow was so hard it knocked Carol's glasses off of her face and sent her staggering into the middle of the living room. Then, all at once, she felt a powerful shove to the middle of her back, and then she fell to her knees. A moment later, blood streaming down the sides of her face and into her ears, Carol collapsed onto the white carpet. Later, when the bathroom man looked inside of Carol's burgundy-colored wallet he had taken from her home, he couldn't believe his eyes. He'd been expecting to see thousands of dollars. Instead, he pulled out a grand total of $150. That day had been one of the rare days that Carol had decided not to bring home the cash from that day's sales at the 2 Classic Cakes locations. Meanwhile, at Temple Makor Shalom, located just a few minutes away from Highgate Lane, Rabbi Fred Newlander was finding it almost impossible to end the workday and get home. He'd had to check in on the weekly Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that was going on in one of the conference rooms, and he'd also sat in on choir rehearsal and one of the Jewish study classes taught by his assistant rabbi. He had checked in with Carol earlier that afternoon by phone before her business meeting. Since their argument on Sunday, their conversations had felt strained. Trying to ignore the frosty tone in his wife's voice, Fred had told her that he was probably going to be late that night, but at around 6 p.m., he did plan to go back to their house and have dinner with their son Matthew, but then he'd be leaving again, and he wouldn't see her again until late. 20-year-old Matthew was a first-year medical student now at nearby Rutgers University, but he was still working part-time as an emergency medical technician with the Cherry Hill Fire Department. He lived at home with his parents, Carol and Fred, but between his classes and his 12-hour EMT shifts, his parents did not actually see much of him. Finally, just after 9 p.m. that night, Fred stepped out the door of McCor Shalom into the cool, cloudy November night. Like his wife Carol, Fred had also been thinking a lot about all the two of them had built and made together over the past nearly 3 decades. He knew his son Matt had overheard him and Carol arguing after they got home from their weekend trip to New York, and he also knew that Matt had wanted to talk to him over their dinner earlier that evening about what was going on with his parents. But his marriage was just not something Fred wanted to discuss with his children, and so he had pointedly turned the conversation in another direction every time Matt tried to talk about it. Now, 15 minutes after leaving the temple, Fred pulled his car into the driveway of 204 Highgate Lane. The lights were on in the house, and Carol's car was in its usual place. A minute later, at 9:20 p.m., Fred was at the front door of his house, and when he tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, he found it was unlocked. Fred shook his head at the lack of security, thinking about all that money Carol might be counting right now at the dining room table. Once the door was open, Fred expected to hear his wife immediately call out to see if that was him, but instead, the house seemed unusually still and quiet. And then, as Fred stepped inside the house, he saw Carol's feet just visible in the entrance to their living room. No shoes, just socks. A few more steps forward, and what Fred saw on the floor and walls and ceiling of the living room was so shocking that for a moment he was sure he was going to pass out. Struggling to make sense of the scene in front of him, Fred slowly started backing up and reaching out blindly behind him for the cordless phone that Carol had left in the entryway just an hour earlier. 2 minutes later, at 9:22 p.m., the dispatcher at the Cherry Hill Police Department picked up an incoming 911 call. The man's voice at the other end of the line sounded like it was being dragged out of him. "My wife is on the floor and there's blood all over." But a minute later, that same man's voice had sharpened into something closer to a scream. Standing in his front hallway talking to 911, Fred realized that his son Matthew was probably hearing this 911 call right now, and that Matt, being an EMT, might be among the medical personnel that were now being rushed to the Newlander family home. The last of his composure crumbled, and Fred began begging the 911 operator not to let his son anywhere near his house. He could not let his son see his mother the way she was. 7 minutes later, Highgate Lane was crowded with police cars and emergency vehicles. Matt had not been allowed inside of the house, and he and Fred were standing together at the end of the driveway when an EMT came over and told them that, unfortunately, Carol was deceased. And no, it did not look like suicide, it looked like murder. By 10 p.m., crime scene techs and homicide detectives had also started arriving at the scene. Officers put up yellow crime tape to hold back the gathering crowd of friends and neighbors that had begun to gather in the street outside of the Newlander's house. Friends also drove to Rebecca's apartment in Philadelphia to bring her back to Cherry Hill to join her father and her brother Matt. Later that same night, Fred's assistant rabbi would call another rabbi near the University of Michigan, where Carol and Fred's other son Benjamin was a freshman, so Benjamin would not be alone when the call came through that his mother was dead. Meanwhile, the investigation into Carol's death was already moving quickly. By 11 p.m. that night, Camden County detectives John Long and Arthur Folks had already zeroed in on their first potential suspect, Fred. After all, he was both the husband of the victim and the person who found Carol's body. And detectives' initial impression of the crime scene had weighed against the idea that the murder had been committed by a stranger in the course of a robbery. There had been no forced entry, no sign that the house had been ransacked, and Carol was still wearing valuable gold and diamond jewelry when her body had been discovered. The detectives were also suspicious of how calm Fred was when they first saw him. And the fact that there was not a single drop or smear of blood on his clothing told them that after finding his wife laying there, Fred had not made any attempt to check for a pulse or try to offer his wife any kind of aid, because if he had, he would have had blood all over him. And although the detectives would have to wait until the forensics reports came back from the crime lab, the techs working the crime scene were not finding any fingerprints, no footprints or even impressions, and no sign of a murder weapon, which made investigators think that this attack had to have been carefully planned. and so detectives instantly became very interested in learning more about the Newlanders' marriage. But before even having their first informal interview with Fred, the detectives assigned police officers to start interviewing neighbors to see if anyone had information about when Carol arrived home that evening and whether neighbors had seen any recent unusual or suspicious activity. Detectives also wanted to know if there were any security cameras on nearby homes that might have captured footage of someone entering or leaving the Newlander house. With all that done, the two detectives left the house just after 11 p.m. and joined Fred and his two older children inside the heated interior of one of the ambulances still parked outside the house. And right away, after speaking with them, the detectives learned about a new number one suspect. Because Rebecca had wasted no time telling the detectives about the two visits her mother had had from the so-called bathroom man, the stranger who had gone into the Newlander home with Carol exactly 1 week ago with the empty envelope, and the second visit had been that night. And now it seemed clear that tonight's visit from the bathroom man must have happened just before Carol was killed. And when Fred told police that Carol often brought home large amounts of cash from the bakeries, detectives realized that if all that turned out to be true, Carol may have been the target of a robbery after all. This possibility was strengthened when Fred and his children were able to confirm that there was something missing from the Newlander house, the burgundy-colored wallet where Carol hid her envelope full of cash. By 1:30 a.m. in the early hours of Wednesday, November 2nd, so just hours after Carol has been found, detectives had relocated to the Cherry Hill police station and were ready to conduct individual formal interviews, starting with Fred and his children. Rebecca repeated her information about the bathroom man, as well as telling police every detail she could remember from her recent phone calls with her mother. As for her parents' marriage, she said she was not aware of any serious problems or issues, but then again, she said she had not been living with them for some time. But in the interview with Rebecca's brother, Matt, which began at 2:30 a.m., he reluctantly admitted that his parents might have been going through some issues in their marriage. He told them about how his parents had gotten into that big fight during their car ride home from New York 3 days earlier, and that after they had returned, his mother had told him that his dad wanted out of the marriage. But by Monday, Matt said that things seemed to have calmed down, and yesterday afternoon, so Tuesday, the day Carol was killed, she'd even called Matt and told him not to worry, that his parents had done a lot of talking together and everything was going to be fine. It was 3:30 a.m. when Fred finally was asked to come into the interrogation room. When he answered the detective's questions, his voice sounded tired. By the end of the interview, it was obvious that he was finding it difficult to focus. He told investigators that the day before, he and Matthew had left the house together after their dinner around 6 p.m., and that Fred had gone straight to the temple, where he stayed until just a few minutes after 9 p.m. And then he drove back home and he discovered his wife. When asked, Fred told detectives that he didn't think Carol was having any issues with any of her coworkers at Classic Cakes. He also told detectives that he couldn't think of really anyone in her life that would want to hurt her. And as for this bathroom man and the letter or package he wanted to give to Rabbi Fred, Fred just shook his head. Unexpected and sometimes bizarre visits came with the territory of ministering to the religious and spiritual needs of 920 different families. But Fred said he was not aware of or expecting any deliveries back on October 25th, so the bathroom man's first visit to Carol, or last night when the bathroom man had made his second appearance. He told detectives that Carol had mentioned the first encounter with the bathroom man to him, but she had seemed more amused by the whole thing than alarmed by it. And she had apparently not given anyone, including Fred or Rebecca or Matt, a real description of what the bathroom man had looked like, aside from saying he was big and dressed in a windbreaker. As for Fred's relationship with Carol, he said it was good, very good, that they both had been very faithful to each other and that they loved each other and never had to go get counseling or anything like that, and at no point had their relationship ever come close to being physically abusive. As Fred said all this, the detectives were acutely aware of the fact that Fred did not mention the fight he had apparently gotten into with Carol a few days earlier, according to his son Matt. When Fred was asked about the lack of blood on his clothes and why he hadn't at least reached down and checked for a pulse when he saw his wife on the floor, Fred bowed his head and then told them that it was immediately obvious to him that she was dead. A few hours after Fred's interview, on that same morning, Wednesday, November 2nd, police were back at the Newlander house to do a thorough inspection of the outside of the property. Crime techs had finished their work earlier in the morning and sent all the evidence they had collected from inside the house to the crime lab for analysis, and Carol's body had been transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. Neighbors woke up that Wednesday morning to the sight of investigators using a ladder truck they'd borrowed from the local fire department to check the roof of the Newlanders' house for any clues. Police officers had also fanned out to interview Carol's business partners and staff at Classic Cakes and Fred's assistant rabbi from Temple McCour Shalom. Other officers were tracking down any leads or information about deliveries to the Newlander property that may have been scheduled for around the time Carol was killed. But despite the promising lead about the bathroom man and the momentum of the first 48 hours, the investigation into Carol's murder almost immediately slowed to a discouraging crawl. No one had come up with any information that would help police find this mysterious bathroom man. Investigators couldn't find any deliveries scheduled for the Newlander house on either October 25th or November 1st, the 2 days the bathroom man was there. And Fred's assistant rabbi just shook his head no when detectives asked him if he knew of any marital problems between Fred and Carol. On Thursday, 2 days after the murder, and the day Carol's body was released by the medical examiner's office back to her family, 2,000 people attended a funeral service for Carol that was held in the sanctuary of Temple McCour Shalom. And after the funeral service, Fred announced that Carol's Shiva, the Jewish equivalent of a wake, would be held at the Newlanders' house, in the same room where Carol was killed. Despite contractors having come in and thoroughly cleaned that room, Carol's friends and family still noticed faint bloodstains under the new coat of paint on the walls and ceiling. It wasn't until the Newlanders' phone records came back a few weeks after Carol's death that police finally got a break in the case. While looking for calls that had been made to or by Carol, police noticed one number that showed up over and over again. But it had nothing to do with Carol, and everything to do with her husband and a very high-profile member of his congregation. And by early December, police uncovered a scandal that would rock Cherry Hill and focus national media attention on one of the state's most charismatic religious leaders. Police would also find another possible suspect in the murder of Carol Newlander. It would turn out Fred had lied to police when he described his marriage as being really solid, and he'd told an even bigger lie when he described himself as being a faithful husband. Instead, starting on December 24th, 1992, so 2 years before Carol was killed, Fred had begun having an affair with a 48-year-old local celebrity and member of his congregation, Elaine Sonsini, and so that phone number that had shown up in the Newlanders' call records was Elaine Sonsini's number. Elaine was a well-known on-air radio personality who hosted a popular morning news program out of a big station in Philadelphia. She had met Fred when he had officiated her late husband's funeral. Before, and especially during, the rabbi's 6-month sabbatical, he and Elaine had been meeting up almost every day to have sex, even deadbolting the door of Fred's private office and using Temple McCour for their illicit get-togethers. As police started to press Elaine for details about her involvement with Fred and whether she had any direct or indirect involvement with the murder of his wife, Elaine, who had a solid alibi, decided it was time to lawyer up and go public with her side of the story and the details of the affair. And suddenly, Fred was back at the top of the suspect list, both in terms of the police investigation and the news accounts that were now appearing in major regional and local media. For Fred, when this affair went public, it was devastating. There are lots of married couples who have experienced infidelity, but in Fred's case, his affair and infatuation with Elaine had automatically stamped him not only as one of America's many unfaithful husbands, but also as a murderer. Even his alibi was now being treated by investigators and definitely by the media as too good, too convenient, that maybe the rabbi had just arranged for his wife's death so he could ride off into the sunset with the beautiful Elaine Sonsini. But despite Fred continuing to shout from the rooftops that he hadn't done anything, and that the police still had not found a single shred of evidence connecting him to his wife's murder, Fred knew it didn't really matter, because the media, and to some degree the police, had already decided he was guilty. And so, desperate to clear his name, Fred went on the offensive. Not only did he hire a defense attorney to represent him, he also revealed to the public that within days of Carol's death, he had already hired his own private investigator to try to find out who killed his wife and why. 49-year-old Len Genoff had been both a member of Temple McCore and an acquaintance of Fred's since 1992. But it was Len's background in security and covert operations with the US and Israeli Secret Services, along with his private investigator's license, that had caught Fred's attention. Len also had close ties with the local police. And even though Len had not really made any more progress in finding Carol's killer than Camden County law enforcement, once Fred went public with Len's involvement in the case in early 1995, Len became a sort of unofficial spokesperson for the embattled rabbi. But for Fred, despite his best efforts, his life seemed to just continue to go from bad to worse. On February 26, 1995, the damage to his reputation had become so bad that he resigned his post as head rabbi of the synagogue he had founded 20 years earlier. Several months later, on June 9, 1995, Fred's lover, Elaine Sonsini, left Fred and married one of the police officers who had been assigned to help with the investigation into Carol Newlander's death. A year after that, in April of 1996, the Central Conference of American Rabbis suspended Fred from practicing as a rabbi for a minimum of 2 years as punishment for his extramarital affair. But despite Fred's life crumbling all around him, his private investigator continued to have his back, telling everyone that while Fred certainly was guilty of adultery, that didn't mean he was also guilty of murder. Fred deeply appreciated Len's support, but what he really needed from his private eye, or from anyone at this point, was evidence about who actually killed his wife. But it wasn't until late April 2000, almost 6.5 years after Carol Newlander was brutally murdered, that police finally would find that evidence. That month, investigators answered a phone call from someone who said they had important information that would help authorities identify Carol's killer. The conversation that came next would turn everything the police thought they knew about this case upside down. Based on what this caller was able to tell law enforcement, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Carol on the evening of November 1st, 1994. The bathroom man was sure he had planned Carol's murder down to the last detail. But when Carol had let him into her house on the night of Tuesday, October 25th, he knew right away that he had made a mistake. As soon as he stepped inside, he had seen immediately that Carol's purse, and more importantly, the burgundy-colored wallet, were nowhere in sight. And so the bathroom man, he struggled for a moment, trying to keep his composure before changing his plan. He had to be sure the purse and the wallet were here. So, thinking quickly, he asked Carol if he could use her bathroom. But instead of actually going to the bathroom, the man just walked around Carol's first floor, checking all of the rooms for this purse and wallet. But when he couldn't find them, he knew he'd just have to come back another time. And so he walked back to the front door where Carol was, and he handed her that envelope, telling her it was the package he had come to give to the rabbi, and then he was about to leave when Carol had opened it up. Now, the bathroom man knew the envelope was empty. Delivering it to the rabbi was just his excuse he was using to get inside of the house. And so when Carol immediately opened the envelope right in front of him and told him, "Hey, look, it's empty," the bathroom man suddenly panicked, wondering if Carol was onto him. But he could see in her face right away that she wasn't. She was just concerned he had not delivered the right letter, and so he should come by another time when he had the right letter. 1 week later, on November 1st, the bathroom man took steps not to repeat his earlier mistake. This time, he waited until Carol had walked inside of her house, carrying her purse over her shoulder, before he also walked up to the door and began knocking. Bathroom man felt a stab of alarm when the door opened and he saw that Carol was talking to someone on the telephone. But that was followed by relief when she invited him inside before he even had to say who he was or why he was there. Once inside, he glanced quickly into both front rooms, and this time he saw the purse sitting on the dining room table. Even as Carol finished her call and placed the cordless phone down on the bench near them in the entryway, Bathroom Man was already adjusting his windbreaker to make sure he could easily access the 1-foot-long metal pipe he had stuck in his back pants pocket. Satisfied that the purse and wallet were definitely here, he focused again on Carol and heard her tell him to follow her through the living room into the sun parlor. But as soon as Carol had turned away from him and had begun taking a few steps across the hardwood floor onto the white carpet, Bathroom Man reached behind his back and pulled out the metal pipe and clutched it in his right hand. And then, with his left hand, he reached out and he grabbed Carol's left shoulder, forcing her to come to an abrupt stop, and then before she could turn around, Bathroom Man had lifted the pipe into the air and brought it crashing down into the back of Carol's head. A moment later, he used his left hand to shove Carol hard in the center of her back, sending her flying into the living room where her knees began to buckle out from under her. As she collapsed forward onto the ground, Carol uttered a single word: "Why?" Bathroom Man didn't answer her. Instead, he turned back to the door and quickly motioned to his much younger accomplice who was waiting outside in the bushes to come inside and finish the job. Seconds later, Bathroom Man had handed off the length of pipe to his much younger companion, and as Bathroom Man headed for the dining room to get the burgundy wallet out of Carol's purse, his companion got to work on Carol. From the dining room, Bathroom Man could hear the sickening thuds of what would be at least 12 savage blows to Carol's head that would break her skull and inflict catastrophic injuries to her brain. An autopsy would later show that Carol had tried to protect herself by putting her hands up over the back of her head, but this younger accomplice of Bathroom Man had hit her hands so hard with the pipe that he'd practically amputated one of her fingers. When Bathroom Man stepped back into the living room to make sure Carol was dead, he had to stop and catch his breath. The beating the younger companion had administered on Carol had taken less than a minute, but in those 45 seconds, the upswings of the metal pipe had sprayed the walls and ceiling with so much blood that it looked like a scene out of a horror movie. And Carol lay on her side at the center of it all, her neat blue pantsuit and print top slowly darkening in the pool of blood, spreading out around her and soaking into the thick pile of the white carpet. Bathroom Man walked over and checked Carol for a pulse, and when he didn't find one, he and his younger companion left the house. Once outside, the two men got into a single car and drove to a nearby brightly lit parking lot outside of a department store. After his younger accomplice changed into clean clothes, Bathroom Man gathered up any blood-stained belongings and the blood-stained pipe, and he stuffed it all into a small duffel bag. Then he pulled out Carol's burgundy wallet. He thought of the thousands of dollars that he was sure to find inside of it as a bonus payment on top of what he had already been paid to commit this murder. But inside the wallet, all he found was $150. The two killers split the money, and then with a sudden gesture of disgust, Bathroom Man threw the burgundy wallet onto the floor of his car. A minute later, Bathroom Man's accomplice had climbed out of the passenger seat and settled in behind the wheel of his own car that he'd parked there earlier in the evening. He gave Bathroom Man a wave before pulling out of the parking lot and heading back to the apartment the two men shared. A few minutes later, Bathroom Man was also on the road, but he was not going back to the apartment. Instead, he headed east towards the nearest police station. He stopped only once along the way to buy 4 cups of coffee. Later that night, he would make a drive out to Philadelphia and stop at different dumpsters along the way to dispose of the small duffel and bloody clothes, the murder weapon, and the empty burgundy wallet. But for right now, he had an alibi he needed to build. So at 9:12 p.m., Bathroom Man, aka Rabbi Fred Newlander's own private investigator, Len Jenoff, did what he did on most Tuesday nights. He drove to the Evesham Township Police Station 5 miles from the Newlander house, and then he walked inside and made his way to the Detective Bureau, where he delivered the coffees he had bought to his good buddies on the night shift, and where he settled in to wait for the news to break that Rabbi Fred Newlander's wife was dead. It wouldn't be until 2 days after Carol's murder, on Thursday, November 3rd, at her funeral service in the sanctuary of Temple Makor Shalom, that Len would again see the person who had promised him $30,000 for killing the rabbi's wife. When it was Len's turn in line to console the stricken and grieving rabbi, Len stepped forward to shake Fred Newlander's hand, but before he could, Carol's husband pulled Len in for a big hug. And when the two men were cheek to cheek, Fred whispered his thanks in Len's ear for getting the job done. The murder had gone exactly as Rabbi Fred Newlander had planned it. It would turn out that back in the summer of 1994, not long after the end of Fred's 6-month sabbatical, his mistress, Elaine Sonsini, had told Fred he had until the end of that year to end his marriage with Carol, or Elaine would break off their affair. As the rabbi started to think about his choices, he decided he'd rather see Carol dead than risk the damage that a divorce might do to his reputation. So, in August, Fred approached Len Genoff, a member of his congregation who claimed to have worked with both the U.S. and Israeli secret services. Both those claims, and almost everything else Len had told people about his background, insecurity, and covert operations, turned out to be false. But when Len's rabbi and spiritual leader Fred Newlander asked him if he would be willing to put his skills to work and kill a so-called enemy of Israel, Len said yes. Only the enemy turned out to be the rabbi's wife, and her only sin was that she stood between the rabbi and his mistress. While Len knew who Carol was, Carol did not know who Len was. There were over 4,000 people in the congregation, and so Carol and Len had just never actually met. After Len agreed to do the job, Fred spent the next few months explaining to Len exactly how he wanted the murder to look, like a robbery gone wrong. Fred also gave Len a hand-drawn map showing the layout of the inside of the Newlander house and where Len should look for Carol's purse and wallet. The murder would have to take place on a Tuesday night when Carol and Fred's son Matthew was at work, and when there were enough evening activities at the temple that Fred could construct an airtight alibi for himself. Then, immediately after the murder, the rabbi would hire Len to act as a private investigator working to clear the rabbi's good name. Len had done a lot of things in his life that he was not proud of, but cold-blooded murder was not one of them. So, for this job, Len had decided to hire an accomplice, his 21-year-old roommate, Paul Daniels. Like his older friend, Paul was a recovering alcoholic, but he was also broke and he suffered from a variety of mental disorders. When Len offered Paul $7,500 if Paul would actually be the one to kill Carol, Paul could not believe his good fortune. On October 20th, 1994, 2 weeks prior to Carol's murder, when Len had actually handed the $7,500 to his young accomplice, Paul had grabbed the money and then jumped up out of his chair, where he spent most of his days watching TV, and he began yelling in excitement, "That bitch is dead!" But starting immediately after Carol's murder, the guilt over what he had done started eating away at Len Genoff. And by the beginning of 1996, so roughly a year and a half after Carol's murder, Len had become an off-the-record source, that's someone who was never identified by name, for a reporter who was covering the investigation into the Carol Newlander homicide. And by May of 2000, almost 6 years after Carol's death, that reporter, who had gradually learned the truth from Len, had convinced Len to go to police and tell them the truth about what happened to Carol. It would take 2 trials before a jury found Fred Newlander guilty of the murder of his wife Carol. As a star witness, Len Genoff was both a blessing and a curse. He could implicate the rabbi as the mastermind who set up the homicide, but Len's own history of telling one huge lie after another about his own life and background threw everything he had to say into question. And compared to the eloquent denials of Rabbi Fred, and the fact that there was no hard evidence linking the rabbi to the actual murder, Fred Newlander's first trial in 2001 ended in a hung jury. But by the time the case was retried less than 1 year later, Rabbi Fred had lost his most important supporters, his children, Matt and Rebecca, both of whom wound up testifying against him. In November of 2002, Rabbi Fred was found guilty of murder and conspiracy, and on January 15, 2003, he was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. Both Len Genoff and his accomplice Paul Daniels were convicted of aggravated manslaughter and sentenced to a maximum of 23 years. They were both released from prison in 2014 after serving their mandatory minimum of 10 years. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please bring the 5-star review button to the movies with you, but instead of giving them popcorn, give them butter-covered styrofoam. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. A 7-year-old boy cowered in the closet of his family's suburban home in Florida. He was buried beneath jackets and sports gear, listening to screams coming from down the hall. When they stopped, the silence that followed was far worse. Then, heavy footsteps approached, and a shadow passed beneath the door. The boy braced for the door to burst open, thinking he was about to be found, but the shadow just moved on. The boy held his breath until he heard the front door to his house open and shut. All the boy wanted to do was stay where he was. But his mother and his brother were in danger, so he swallowed his fear, pushed through all the coats, and stepped out. The house was silent and still. No broken furniture, no blood. At least, until he reached the bedroom. There was a figure on the bed, and the sight was too much to process for the 7-year-old. And so he just immediately looked away. His gaze fell on a phone lying on the blood-soaked sheet, its screen still glowing. And then a voice rose from the phone's speakers. Someone was still on the line. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please change the follow button's keyboard settings to another language so their typing makes no sense. Okay, let's get into today's story. Nikki Halpin couldn't believe how well things were going. On January 8, 2004, the 32-year-old single mother was at a pizzeria in Safety Harbor, Florida, enjoying a night out with her boyfriend Chris and her sons, 7-year-old Drew and 9-year-old Max. Nikki had only been seeing Chris for a few months, and he hadn't had much interaction with her boys yet. But so far, tonight, he was nailing it. Chatting easily with Drew about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and also making sure to include Max too. When Nikki heard Max start to giggle over something Chris had said, Nikki suddenly felt the spark of happiness. She liked Chris, but until tonight, she really hadn't been convinced that their relationship had long-term potential. They'd met online, gone on a few dates, and it had been fine. Not exciting, but fine. But maybe that was okay. Chris was about her age, and he was an engineer with his life together. He checked the boxes, and maybe that was all she needed. Somebody who was solid, simple, and stable, who could make her boys laugh. I mean, that kind of relationship would certainly be a big change for Nikki. Her ex-husband, Donald, had been the opposite of Chris. He was an imposing prison guard and former boxer, built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and was almost twice her age. They met when Nikki was just 22, and Donald was 41. Her family had thought he was too old for her, but she had fallen in love with his rugged good looks and charm. But then life got complicated. Their eldest child, Max, was born with health issues, and the endless hospital bills and stress really strained their marriage. Donald started drinking more, their fights got worse and worse, and after nearly a decade together, it was just over. They separated in 2001 and finalized the divorce 2 years later. But for Nikki, she had actually been relieved. She had her freedom back. And so pretty quickly, she had struck up another relationship with a young, fit HVAC repairman named Dan Welch. Dan had seemed really exciting and charming, and for a while, Nikki had been convinced he was the one. But Dan didn't work out. He really just wanted to have fun, not get married. And so Nikki had ultimately dumped him. After Dan, Nikki had gone on plenty more dates, but Chris was really the first guy in a long time who felt like he could actually be something real. After dinner, Nikki and her sons drove Chris back home and dropped him off around 9:30 p.m. Less than 15 minutes later, they pulled into their own driveway, where the sight of the new house they'd just recently moved into made Nikki smile. It was much bigger and nicer than anywhere she'd lived with Donald, and the city of Safety Harbor felt exactly how she'd hoped. Quiet, warm, and safe. The perfect place to raise her kids. They went inside, and immediately the boys kicked off their shoes and headed in opposite directions. Drew went to the living room to finish his homework, while Max ran straight to his bedroom and powered on his video game console. As for Nikki, she walked down the hall to her office, and she turned on the family computer. The instant messenger app was still open from earlier, and she glanced at the text window, and she saw there was a new message from Chris. It said, "How'd you get home so fast?" Nikki frowned, not sure why he would ask that, but when her eyes moved up the chat window, she saw that a message had been sent from her account at 9:33 p.m., while she was still out driving. The message contained only 2 letters, HB. Now, keep in mind, this was 2004, so the instant messenger app could not have been on Nikki's phone. It could only be accessed from her computer, which meant that that message could have only been sent from right here, this physical location, by somebody other than her. Nikki, who now had goosebumps all over her body, just stared at the screen and then typed back to Chris, "I didn't write that." Nikki grabbed her home phone and called Chris, and when he answered and she explained what was going on, he sounded confused and worried about her. Nikki asked him to please stay on the line while she looked around her house. There could be an intruder. And so while clutching the phone and doing her best to stay calm, Nikki began going from room to room, checking to make sure they were empty. All the while, the only sound that filled the house were the beeps and chimes of Max's video game. At some point, after checking one of these rooms, Nikki went back into the hallway and was going towards the next room to check. However, before she got there, she heard something and turned around. And when she did, she froze. "15 minutes later, at approximately 9:50 p.m., Deputy Brad Ferguson of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office was out on patrol when a dispatcher's voice came over the radio. A man had just called 911 in a panic. He said that he'd been on the phone with his girlfriend when she suddenly started screaming. The girlfriend's name was Nikki, and she was home with her 2 sons at 12 Clearview Drive in Safety Harbor. Deputy Ferguson switched on a siren and floored it towards the address. When he arrived, he knocked hard on the door. And to his surprise, a middle-aged man answered, looking very confused. Deputy Ferguson asked if someone named Nikki lived there, and the man said yes. The man called out Nikki's name, and a minute later, a teenage girl appeared. But to Ferguson, something just didn't feel right. Nothing about this scene matched the urgency or the information in that 911 call. Deputy Ferguson radioed dispatch and quickly realized there'd been a mistake. He was at the wrong house. The caller had given the wrong address, and it was just pure coincidence that there happened to be a Nikki there too. The real location was 15 Clearview Drive, literally next door. This mistake meant Deputy Ferguson had lost precious minutes. He raced 30 feet over to the correct house, and the man from the wrong house followed right behind because he knew Nikki Halpin's family. They were neighbors. The lights were on inside of Nikki's home, but when they knocked, no one answered. The neighbors started shouting for Nikki and Drew and Max, and eventually 2 faces appeared in the window next to the front door. It was the boys, but there was no sign of Nikki. The boys recognized their neighbor and opened the door. Deputy Ferguson immediately noticed blood spatter on Max's t-shirt. When he asked where their mother was, Drew pointed down the hall. Ferguson walked into the house and headed in the direction the boy had pointed. And moments later, he stepped into the bedroom. and there was Nikki. She lay motionless on the bed. The blankets around her were soaked with blood, and there were deep wounds on the left side of her head. It was instantly clear this was a crime scene. Ferguson realized the attacker could still be inside, so he shouted for Nikki's neighbor to take the boys back to his home and lock the doors. After that, he radioed for backup and began clearing the house on his own. Gun drawn, he went room by room, closet by closet, until he was sure that whoever had done this was already gone. It frustrated Deputy Ferguson to think that the time he'd wasted going to the wrong house might have made all the difference. It might have given Nikki's attacker the chance to slip away. Minutes later, an ambulance arrived, followed by a fleet of police cars. Nikki was actually still breathing, but barely. So paramedics airlifted her to a trauma center, fighting to keep her alive the whole way. Meanwhile, the evidence retrieval crew got to work processing the crime scene. The house was littered with toys and sports equipment, which made searching for fingerprints or DNA even more time-consuming than usual, so the team knew they were in for a long night. Shortly after midnight, 2 detectives arrived to take over the investigation for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Their names were Ed Judy and Robert Snipes, and they were both seasoned investigators with over a decade of experience under their belts. Judy and Snipes spoke to the officers processing the scene, who told them that, as of right now, Nikki was still clinging to life at the hospital. But based on what they'd seen, the chances she'd survive were slim. Whoever had attacked her appeared to have hit her in the head and upper body over and over again with something very heavy and blunt. But so far, the evidence retrieval crew had not found whatever that weapon was. In fact, they hadn't found much of anything. There was no evidence of a break-in or signs that anything had been stolen. But Detective Judy was not surprised. The viciousness of the attack did not feel like a robbery, and he was already beginning to suspect that the motive might be personal. After checking out the crime scene, Judy and Snipes left the house and headed next door to speak with Drew and Max, who were still with the neighbor. They tried to talk to the 9-year-old, Max, but he was completely unresponsive. Nikki's neighbor explained that Max had medical issues and rarely spoke, and now he may be traumatized too, and so that left 7-year-old Drew. The detectives sat Drew down in the kitchen, and as gently as they could, they asked him to tell them what he saw. There was a long silence, and at first, the detectives weren't sure the boy would even answer them. But then, he started talking. Drew told the detectives that he had been in the living room doing math problems when he heard his mother scream. He looked up and he saw her running down the hall, and there was this large man in dark clothes with a black mask on, carrying something long and shiny, maybe a metal baseball bat. He said his mother screamed for him to go hide, and then she disappeared into the bedroom, and the masked man followed her inside. Drew was so scared he couldn't move, but he followed his mother's instructions and he hid until he heard the attacker leave. At that point, he snuck out of his hiding place and ran into the bedroom, where he found his mother, unconscious, and his brother Max, cowering behind the bed. Drew took Max's hand and led him to the bathroom, where the brothers hid until they heard their neighbor's voice calling them from outside. When Drew finished telling the story, the detectives realized that the boy's ordeal was far worse than anyone realized. Max, the 9-year-old, had actually been in the bedroom with his mother while she was being attacked. By this point, it was nearing 2 a.m., and the boys were obviously exhausted. But Detective Judy had one more question. He asked Drew if he recognized the attacker. Now, Judy didn't expect much of an answer out of Drew, since the man had worn a mask, but to his surprise, Drew nodded and said yes. The boy looked right at Judy and said, "It was the man who knocks on the windows." On the drive back to the station, Detective Judy and Snipes talked over everything they'd learned, starting with Drew's final comment about the man who knocks on the windows. They had asked Drew what he meant, but the boy had not been able to explain beyond that. The detectives weren't sure if the man who knocks on the windows was a real clue or a garbled story from a deeply traumatized child, but whichever it was, they couldn't make sense of it right now. So they agreed to log the statement and come back to it later. For now, they decided to focus on the information from Drew that did sound reliable, and that was that the intruder was a man. This fact lined up both with their suspicions and with their training, which told them that whenever a woman is attacked, the culprit is usually an intimate partner. And so, in the detective's eyes, all the men in Nikki's life were now potential suspects. When the detectives got back to the station, Nikki's boyfriend, Chris, was waiting in an interview room to give a statement. Chris had been at his house talking to Nikki over the phone when he actually heard the attack. He was the one who actually made the 911 call. Logistically, it seemed hard to imagine how he could have done those two things if he had committed the attack himself. But at this point, Judy and Snipes weren't actually ruling anyone out. They knew Chris could have hired a hitman, for example, and there were a couple elements of Chris's story that raised questions. For example, they wanted to know why Chris gave dispatch the wrong address. The mix-up cost valuable time that possibly allowed Nikki's attacker to escape. And they also wanted to know, when Chris heard his girlfriend being attacked, why didn't he try to go to her house to check on her himself? He could have called 911 on the way from his cell phone. So the detectives sat down across from Chris and got right into it. Their first question, about the wrong address, Chris answered easily. He said he had been in a panic and simply mixed up the numbers. But the second question, about why he didn't do more to help Nikki, or at least go check on her, seemed to trip Chris up, and he kind of stumbled through a pretty confusing explanation. He said he had considered going to her house when he heard her scream on the phone, but he didn't because he was afraid that someone was waiting outside his own door and would attack him too if he tried to leave. To Judy and Snipes, this answer just seemed weird. There was no reason for Chris to think he would be targeted in some kind of coordinated two-pronged attack, and he hadn't mentioned it to the 911 dispatcher at all. It sounded like a pretty outlandish excuse. And so by the end of the interview, both Judy and Snipes were more skeptical of Chris than they had been when they walked in. But they still couldn't figure out a way for him to have been present for the attack while he was also home talking to Nikki on his landline phone. So despite having a few misgivings, they thanked Chris for his time and let him go. As soon as Chris was gone, Snipes called the hospital for an update on Nikki's status. It was now 3 a.m., 6 hours after the attack. Snipes was not expecting good news, so it came as a relief when the doctors told him that no, Nikki is actually still alive. Her vitals were stable, and it was looking more likely that she'd survive the night. Still, her doctors stressed that her condition was dire. After getting off the phone, Snipes shared the news with his partner, and then they got to work on their next task, contacting Nikki's family to fill them in and see if they knew anything useful. Unfortunately, a quick search told them that Nikki's parents and siblings were 1,300 miles away in Massachusetts, and this kind of news was just too serious to deliver over the phone. So they called up the nearest precinct and arranged for a local officer to drive out to her parents' place and talk to them in person. That local officer knocked on Nikki's parents' home right as the sun was coming up. Nikki's mother answered, looking confused and tired. When the officer told her about the attack on her daughter, she gasped and began crying. The officer reached out a hand, offering her support, but the mother gathered herself quickly and then looked up through her tears and told the officer she could guess who had done this: Nikki's ex-husband, Donald. To explain this, Nikki's mother told a story that stretched back a decade to 1994, in the early days of Nikki and Donald's marriage. That November, their oldest son Max was born with life-threatening complications. A buildup of fluid in his skull put too much pressure on his brain, and he only narrowly survived. Over the next few years, Max endured dozens of brain surgeries, and during one of those surgeries, a nurse accidentally gave him the wrong medication, and it nearly killed him. Nikki and Donald sued the hospital over the incident, kicking off a drawn-out and very expensive legal battle that created a lot of financial pressure on the family. These new money problems, along with Max's ongoing health issues, led to constant stress in their household, which eventually contributed to the collapse of Nikki and Donald's marriage. And then soon after their divorce was finalized, the hospital finally settled in the case, granting Max a trust fund of $1.5 million. And in the legal wrangling that followed, Nikki had become sole custodian of that fund, and Donald was shut out completely. He would never see a dime. This is why Nikki's mom thought Donald might have attacked her daughter. She believed that he simply harbored a grudge over the money. Detectives Judy and Snipes were already on their way to Donald's place when the Massachusetts officer who visited Nikki's mom called them to tell them about Donald's potential million-dollar motive. Now, Judy and Snipes already considered Donald a suspect simply because he was Nikki's ex-husband, but this new information shot him right to the top of their suspect list. They found Donald at home in his bachelor pad apartment, sitting down to coffee and the morning newspaper. When they told him that Nikki had been attacked last night and was in critical condition at the hospital, Donald looked at them in shock and then demanded to know where his kids were. The detectives calmly explained that the boys were perfectly safe, but they currently were in the custody of social services. They couldn't be released to Donald until the detectives were confident that he wasn't involved in the attack. Now, Judy and Snipes watched as Donald processed the fact that they were treating him like a suspect. He seemed surprised, and in a tight voice, he told them to come in and ask whatever they wanted. Inside, as Judy and Snipes launched into their questions, it quickly became clear that the divorce was a very sensitive topic for Donald, but not just because of that trust. He did say he did not think Nikki was managing the fund properly, but beyond that, he told the detectives that actually, he was still in love with Nikki. But this admission really only made Donald even more attractive as a suspect. Maybe, the detectives thought, he was jealous that Nikki was dating other people. So they asked Donald if he would come back to the station for a polygraph test, and he said yes. Detectives Judy and Snipes were hoping to use this polygraph test to press Donald about whether he really still loved Nikki or if his love had turned to anger. They wanted to try to catch him in a lie. But as soon as they got the machine up and running, Donald started passing question after question without so much as a blip. The detectives started to wonder if maybe they and Nikki's family had misjudged Donald. But then it happened. Judy asked Donald if he knew who hurt Nikki. Donald said no, and the machine registered a sharp rise in his heartbeat. This signified a possible lie. Snipes felt a rush of exhilaration, but he didn't mention anything about it until the test was done. When it was done, he confronted Donald about the question he'd failed. Donald took a long time to respond, and when he finally did, he said that he hadn't lied. He really didn't know who hurt Nikki. But if he was being totally transparent, he did suspect someone. He hadn't said anything until now because he didn't want to point fingers without any evidence. But if the detectives really wanted to know his opinion, Donald thought they should look into Dan Welch, the young, fit HVAC repairman Nikki dated after their separation. To both Judy and Snipes, Donald's accusation against Dan Welch just seemed like a desperate attempt to divert attention away from him. But then Donald explained why he suspected Dan, and it was surprisingly convincing. Donald said that Nikki actually used to vent to him all the time about Dan. At first, she'd been really into their relationship, but when she began talking about marriage, Dan apparently wasn't interested, so Nikki had dumped him. But after she dumped him, Donald said that Nikki had told him it was like a switch had flipped. Dan was devastated. He refused to accept that it was over and kept calling Nikki and begging her to take him back for months afterward. Eventually, Nikki turned to Donald for advice, and he told her to take out a restraining order. When Judy and Snipes finished their interview with Donald, they still weren't convinced he was innocent. However, they now had a second suspect, Dan Welch. The first thing Judy and Snipes did as they began digging into Dan was to search for that restraining order that Donald apparently had told Nikki to file. But there wasn't one. Not only had Nikki not taken out a restraining order against Dan, but nobody had. In fact, Dan had no criminal record of any kind. And the more Judy and Snipes thought about it, the more they realized that what Donald told them about Dan just didn't add up. Dan Welch had gotten himself dumped for not wanting to marry Nikki, while Donald fully admitted that he himself was still in love with her, and that was quite a motive. But before they could make any final judgments, they needed to talk to Dan. But that interview would have to wait. It was now late in the afternoon, on the day after Nikki's attack. Detectives Judy and Snipes had been up for more than 24 hours working this case, and they were fading fast. Before they spoke to any more suspects, they needed to get some sleep. The pair reconvened the next morning at the station, and the first thing they did was call the hospital to check on Nikki. And unfortunately, the news was bad. She had spent 36 hours on life support, she was unconscious, and showing no signs of brain activity. It was unlikely she was ever going to recover. This put the detectives in a somber mood as they headed out to talk to Nikki's ex-boyfriend, Dan. Dan lived in Clearwater, just a few miles away from Nikki's home in Safety Harbor. Judy and Snipes wanted to catch him off guard, so they didn't call ahead before they knocked on his door. When Dan answered, the detectives studied his face as they told him they were here to speak about Nikki. They deliberately did not tell him why, because they wanted to see if the mention of Nikki made him nervous, or angry, or emotional in any way. But Dan just stared at them, like he couldn't understand what they were saying. In fact, he was acting like he didn't even know who Nikki was. So when Dan just continued to look confused, the detectives repeated themselves, this time using Nikki's full name. And that's when a look of recognition passed over Dan's face. He quickly waved them inside and said he'd been confused because he always called Nikki Nicole. Dan said he had heard about the attack on the radio and had been expecting a visit. As they walked to his living room, Dan kept saying how he was happy to help the investigation. But to the detectives, he seemed almost too eager. Dan's upbeat demeanor felt forced, and Judy and Snipes could sense anxiety just beneath the surface. They had barely sat down when Dan had already offered to provide DNA samples and invited the detectives to search his apartment for evidence. The detectives told Dan that yes, they would love to do both of those things, but first, they just wanted to talk. They told him that they had heard his breakup with Nikki might have gotten a bit ugly, and so they wanted to hear his side of the story. If there was any truth to Donald's accusations about Dan harassing Nikki following the breakup, the detectives thought this question might trigger some sort of reaction. But Dan just sort of shrugged it off. He said he had gotten over Nicole a long time ago, and he was now seeing somebody else. Dan also had an alibi for the night of the attack. He said he had spent the evening working out with a buddy and then went home around 10 p.m., and then he called his girlfriend. Dan pulled up contact information for both of those people and gave it to Judy and Snipes. At this point, the detectives weren't sure what to think of Dan. They figured his alibi would check out, otherwise Dan would not have volunteered it. So maybe Dan's anxiety they were sensing was just regular anxiety. I mean, plenty of totally innocent people get nervous around cops and often kind of over-explain themselves like Dan was doing. It didn't necessarily mean he was hiding something. But just to be safe, Judy asked Dan if he'd be willing to come to the station to take a polygraph, and like Judy expected, Dan said yes. When they got back to the station, they set Dan up in a private room and hooked him up to the polygraph machine. Dan said he was ready, so Judy began asking questions, with Snipes watching the monitor for signs of emotional distress. And pretty much right away, Snipes saw the needle spike. That meant Dan was hiding something. According to the machine, he was lying. But as Judy asked another question, and another, something weird began to happen. Every question, even baseline questions about what day of the week it was, the machine would mark Dan's response as a possible lie. And with these kinds of results, it was hard to know if Dan was actually lying or if he was just so anxious that basically anything he said was setting off the machine. The detectives both knew that even in the best cases, polygraph tests are not perfect. The fact that Dan was failing so badly definitely raised their suspicions of him, but it wasn't a reason to hold or charge him. So after asking him the remainder of the questions, which Dan basically failed entirely, they had no choice but to let him go. That evening, Judy and Snipes talked through the case, weighing their potential suspects. They had now spoken to the last 3 men in Nikki's life. First, there was Chris, Nikki's current boyfriend. His explanation about not rushing to help Nikki because he thought he might be in danger, because there was somebody outside his door, still struck them as extremely weird. But the fact that he had called 911 as the attack was ongoing made it hard to see him as the culprit. They still hadn't ruled him out completely, but he was admittedly less suspicious than their other 2 suspects. Next, there was Donald, Nikki's ex-husband. And of all 3 suspects, he had the strongest motive, since with Nikki out of the way, he would not only get custody of their kids, but also control of a $1 million trust. And the fact that he had pointed the finger at Dan, Nikki's ex-boyfriend, was also suspicious, especially since there was no criminal record of the problems Donald had told them about. That on its own was almost enough to convince them that Donald was their guy, he was guilty. Except that their third suspect, Dan, the ex-boyfriend, had failed every question on his polygraph test. All in all, the detectives agreed that it was still too early to draw any firm conclusions. Just 2 days had passed since the attack, and so far, the investigation had been moving at a breakneck pace. Judy and Snipes felt good about how much they'd learned already, but didn't want to miss an important clue by rushing things. They would continue interviewing Nikki's family and friends, while keeping a particularly close eye on Dan and Donald. Those 2 they were the most suspicious of, and they figured if one of them was guilty, hopefully they would slip up and do something to give themselves away. The next day was January 11th. 3 days had passed since the attack, and incredibly, Nikki was still clinging to life. However, that morning, her doctors told her family that she would never wake up. So, Nikki's family said their final goodbyes at the hospital, then doctors turned off the machines that were keeping her alive. Nikki died shortly afterwards. And so that meant that Judy and Snipes were now officially dealing with a homicide case. Also, Nikki's death started a ticking clock on the custody of her sons. Drew and Max were still in social services because Judy and Snipes considered their father, Donald, a suspect. But that couldn't continue indefinitely. If the detectives didn't charge Donald soon, the boys would be released into his care, and Donald would take control of Max's $1 million trust. Over the next few days, Judy and Snipes continued interviewing Nikki's friends and colleagues, but they didn't come up with much new information. The only interesting tidbit came from a friend of Nikki, and it didn't help the detectives narrow things down at all. This friend said she thought the killer could be Chris, who was Nikki's most recent boyfriend, and the one who had called 911 during the attack. This friend said that Chris was jealous, and the couple argued all the time. And so all this left Judy and Snipes in a tough spot. They had lots of suspicions, but no hard evidence against anyone. A week passed, then another, with no significant new leads, and the detectives started to worry that their case was about to go cold. On February 16th, just over a month after Nikki's death, an office assistant at the sheriff's department was transcribing audio files from the case as part of the standard bookkeeping process. The case was approaching a dead end, and she was responsible for filing everything away properly. This assistant had already processed the dozens of hours of police interviews with Donald, Dan, and Chris, and she was nearly done. The last file on her list was the actual 911 call Chris had made on the night of the attack, January 8th. The assistant didn't expect it to take long, but when she put on her headphones and hit play, she heard something on this call that made her jump out of her chair. She had to stop and rewind the tape, going back to the start over and over again, just to make sure she wasn't hearing things. The audio was garbled, and it was hard to tell what was actually going on, but after a few listens, she was sure. It was not her imagination. The sound she had heard was definitely there, just buried under multiple layers of distortion. So the assistant dashed down the hall to Detective Judy's office and played the file for him and Snipes. At first, the detectives couldn't understand what she was so excited about, but then the assistant adjusted the levels a bit and played the call again. This time, through the crackly static, Judy and Snipes heard what she was talking about. Just like that, they knew exactly who killed Nikki Halpert. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and the recording of the 911 call, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Halpert on the night of January 8, 2004. The house at 15 Clearview Drive, Safety Harbor, was silent and empty when, at approximately 9:30 p.m., the killer rode up on a bike. They stashed their bike out of view beside the garage and then looked around quickly to make sure nobody was walking past. Then, satisfied they were alone, the killer lifted the garage door up maybe a foot or so and rolled underneath. Once the killer was inside, they began to rifle through their backpack. They pulled out a mask and put it on. Then they took out a heavy silver flashlight, so large that at a glance, it almost looked like a metal baseball bat. Then, with the flashlight in hand, the killer walked from the garage into the house itself. Within moments, the killer was creeping through the quiet house down the hall. They headed to Nikki's office, where they switched on the computer. When the screen lit up, the instant messenger app was already open, and Nikki's conversation with Chris was visible on the screen. Just then, the icon beside Chris's handle changed colors, indicating that he was now online. The killer thought for a moment, and then hit a couple of keys at random and hit enter. A few seconds later, a response came through from Chris. "How'd you get home so fast? You must have run every red light." As the killer read that, they smiled. Now, they knew Nikki was on her way home. Killer switched off the computer screen and walked into a different room and hid. A few minutes later, the killer heard the front door open, followed by the sounds of Drew and Max running happily into the house. The killer stayed where they were, thinking Nikki would soon pass by. but the wait took longer than they expected. And so as the minutes ticked by, the killer grew impatient. And so eventually they poked their head out of the room where they were hiding, and right then they heard Nikki talking to someone in the hall. It sounded like she was on the phone, and she was saying something about an intruder in the house. With a sudden pang of horror, the killer realized their mistake. Nikki must have gone into her office. She had seen the message and realized someone had sent it from her computer when she was still gone. There was no more time to wait. The killer sprinted into the hall, where Nikki turned around, saw them, and screamed. The sound filled the killer with a blinding rage, and they shouted right back at her, "Nicole, calm down!" But Nikki didn't calm down. She turned and ran. And as she passed by the living room, she shouted for Drew to hide, and then continued into the bedroom to try to help Max hide. But the killer chased after her and grabbed her and threw her onto the bed. She screamed and tried to fight them off, but the killer swung that heavy flashlight as hard as they could into her head and her shoulders and her neck over and over until she stopped moving. The killer completely ignored Max, the 9-year-old who was right next to the bed, cowering, who had just watched this happen to his mother. The killer simply turned, dashed out of the room, taking the bloody flashlight with them. However, what the killer failed to notice was the phone lying on the bed beside Nikki's limp body. The line was still open, and on the other end, Chris was listening over speakerphone while he spoke to the police on his cell phone. And so with Chris's phones so close together, the audio from Nikki's room was picked up and recorded along the 911 call. It was very faint and heavily degraded, but with a little effort, the phrase, "Nicole, calm down," could be heard in the background. And this was the phrase that blew the investigation wide open. When the sheriff's department assistant had heard those words, she instantly recognized the killer's voice, since she'd just transcribed hours of interrogation videos with them. But it wasn't just the voice that gave the killer away. One word caught on that tape sealed the killer's fate. Every single person in her life called her Nikki. Every person except for one. Only Nikki's ex-boyfriend, Dan Welch, the HVAC guy, called her Nicole. It was his voice on the recording. His voice saying, "Nicole, calm down," right before he struck her with the flashlight in front of her own kids. It would turn out that Nikki's ex-husband, Donald, had been telling the truth when he said Dan was harassing Nikki. Ever since their breakup, Dan had been stalking Nikki, showing up at her house without warning and pounding on the windows while shouting for her to come out and talk. And this fact likely explains the strange way Nikki's son Drew had described his mother's killer. To a child, Dan was the man who knocks on the windows. Dan was indicted in January of 2006 and eventually pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and will be eligible for parole in 2028. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In the middle of the night on January 25th, 2014, 80-year-old Peggy Nadell was sound asleep in her second-story bedroom, and then suddenly her phone began to ring. Peggy woke up startled and looked over at the clock and saw it was past 1 a.m. And so to be getting a call this late could only mean one thing. This was bad news. And so nervously, Peggy answered the phone and quietly said hello. Peggy would be correct. This phone call was bad news, but it was far worse than anything Peggy could have imagined. And moments after getting that call, Peggy would be fighting for her life. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the Amazon Music follow button's cookies with dog treats. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a December afternoon in 2013, 80-year-old Peggy Nadell gazed out of her second-story bedroom window, watching the snow fall onto the ground below. Peggy's large gray wooden house sat tucked away in Valley Cottage, New York, a small upscale enclave located in Clarkstown, less than an hour northwest of New York City. Peggy had lived in this house for 50 years. She loved her small town, and she thought there was something really special about it in the winter. The snow made everything quiet, beautiful, and almost otherworldly. In her bedroom, Peggy glanced down at her watch. She felt like she could stand there for hours just staring at the snowfall, but she had someplace to be, and Peggy hated being late. So she walked out of her room and down a hallway across an old hardwood floor to the stairs. Peggy held onto the banister and slowly made her way to the first floor. At 80 years old, Peggy was still in great shape. She exercised almost every day at the nearby Jewish community center, and even when there was snow on the ground and it was freezing outside, she still enjoyed walking around town or in the public park that was close to her house. But Peggy admitted that the stairs in her house had begun to get a bit tricky for her, and her daughter, Suzanne, had become paranoid that Peggy was going to take a bad fall and hurt herself on the stairs. So Peggy, not wanting to worry her family, now made it a point to take her time when she was going up and down the stairs and to always hold on to the banister. Peggy finally reached the first floor, and she walked across the living room towards the front of the house. Peggy's house was almost like a museum, and also a time capsule. There were paintings hung on the walls, and small sculptures and other pieces of art that could be found on tables and shelves in the living room, but there was also 50 years worth of family keepsakes, photos of her grown children at almost every age, and some recent drawings her grandkids had made for her. Peggy pulled a long coat off a coat rack by the front door, and she put it on over her black sweater. Peggy had short brown hair that she styled every day, and she wore red lipstick. Peggy had been obsessed with fashion from a young age, and that obsession had never really gone away. So she always tried to look and dress her best whenever she left the house. Peggy grabbed a leather bag that contained books, notebooks, and pens. Then she set the house alarm by pushing on a keypad by the door, and then she walked outside across the porch to her car parked in the driveway. Peggy got in, started the car, turned on the radio, and began heading towards New York City. After driving into the city and parking her car, Peggy made her way through a big throng of people walking down Fifth Ave in Manhattan. She looked at the holiday decorations and Christmas lights hanging around the street, and she had a huge smile on her face. As much as Peggy loved living in her sleepy little town, there was nothing quite like being in the big city. Over the course of her life, Peggy had traveled all over the world. She'd seen Roman ruins, the pyramids in Egypt, and she'd laid on beautiful beaches all around the globe. But New York City had always been a very special place for her. Peggy walked for a few minutes and then stepped into a white stone building that housed one of the City University of New York's campuses in the area. Inside, Peggy made her way to a small classroom where she was sitting in on a PhD-level art history class. Peggy said hello to some of the other students who had already arrived. Many of them were at least 50 years younger than she was. Peggy made it to her seat, she pulled off her coat and put it on the back of her chair, then she sat down and grabbed her notebook out of her bag. A young woman sitting nearby smiled, and Peggy smiled back. Peggy knew she must be a bit of a mystery to most of her fellow students. They must have wondered why this well-dressed old lady was in class with them. But anybody who knew Peggy even reasonably well knew that she had always prized learning and education above almost anything else. Back in the mid-1950s, Peggy had fallen in love with a man named Robert Nadell, and she had gotten married to him. And not long after they got married, Peggy gave birth to their daughter, Suzanne. Then, a couple of years later, Peggy had their son, Jim. And Peggy loved being a mother, but she didn't want to just stay at home. So she had decided to go back to school to get her MBA, a graduate business degree. Her husband Robert had been totally thrilled about her decision. He thought Peggy was one of the smartest people he'd ever met, and he knew how important education was to her. But at the time, most other people around Peggy had thought she was crazy for wanting to go back to school for anything, especially a master's degree in business, because at this time in the 1960s, women represented less than 1% of students at the top MBA programs in the United States. But Peggy believed it was her duty to continue learning as much as she could, and she had refused to accept that being a woman had anything to do with her ability to succeed in business school or the corporate world. And so after getting her MBA, Peggy had proven everybody who doubted her wrong. She had gone on to work for Xerox, a huge corporation that was a pioneer in photocopiers and other technology products, and after years of working at that company, Peggy had become one of Xerox's first female executives. Peggy had a long and very successful career, and when she had finally stepped away from her work, she enjoyed retirement right alongside her husband Robert. They had loved to travel, and they had spent a lot of their time helping their community by volunteering for local groups and charities. And as much as Peggy had loved her high-powered executive job, she actually enjoyed the volunteer work that she and Robert were able to do even more. But then, in 2003, Robert had died unexpectedly, and suddenly Peggy had found herself all alone in her big old house. Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, lived about 20 minutes away, and so the mother and daughter spent a lot of time together. But Peggy knew Suzanne had a life and a job that kept her busy, and Peggy didn't want to give up on all the things that made her happy just because she was on her own now. She wanted to keep learning about new things and experiencing new things. So Peggy had begun to study art history, a subject she'd always been interested in. And eventually she decided she wanted to learn as much as she possibly could about art history. So at 80 years old, Peggy began sitting in on these PhD-level art history classes. Not to get another degree, but just because she really loved it and wanted to learn more. Peggy listened closely and took extensive notes during the professor's lecture. And as Peggy wrote in her notebook, she almost felt like a kid again. She knew how absurd that would sound to the others in the class. After all, she was a mother and a grandmother, and she had lived a full life by this point. But Peggy felt like learning new things was really the best way to stay active and engaged in the world around her. Later that night, Peggy was in her bedroom, still thinking about what she learned that day in class, as she changed out of her clothes into her nightgown. Then, once she was changed, she sat down on her bed, and she grabbed the home phone off the bedside table. Now, there were two people Peggy usually talked to multiple times a day: her daughter, Suzanne, and her daughter-in-law, Diana. Peggy knew both women liked to check on her a lot to make sure she was okay. Suzanne was paranoid about Peggy falling down the stairs, and Diana, who was married to Peggy's son and lived in Florida, worried about Peggy going out and driving when it was cold and snowing. Peggy regularly reminded her daughter and daughter-in-law that she was more than capable of taking care of herself, but she did love talking to them both and staying in touch. So Peggy called her daughter, Suzanne, and told her all about the day's art history class. Then, after she was done speaking to Suzanne, Peggy called Diana in Florida. Now, Peggy's son was not much for phone calls, so his wife, Diana, was really Peggy's only real connection to her grandkids who lived so far away. Peggy told Diana that she really missed everybody and that she was hoping she could pay for Diana and her son's two kids to come visit her in New York that summer. When Diana heard that, she got really excited and said the kids would love that. Eventually, the two women wrapped up the call and said goodnight, and then Peggy hung up the phone and walked over to the bedroom window. It was still snowing outside, and the snowflakes seemed to glow under the streetlights. Peggy was still struck by how beautiful the winter scene always looked, but now that she knew her grandkids were very likely coming to visit her, she could not wait for summer to arrive. Over a month later, on January 24th, 2014, Peggy was in her room getting ready for bed again. Peggy had kept busy over the recent holiday season. She'd spent the first night of Hanukkah with her daughter Suzanne, and she'd also talked to her daughter-in-law Diana and her grandkids in Florida almost every day. She'd gone to various holiday parties in town with close friends, and she continued to exercise at the Jewish Community Center. But despite how fun the holiday season had been, it still totally wore Peggy out, and she was still feeling tired weeks later. So she was hoping to sleep in late the following morning and get caught up on some much-needed rest. It hadn't snowed in weeks, but temperatures had dropped to a freezing 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was cold and drafty inside of Peggy's old house. So she climbed into bed and pulled a whole pile of warm blankets over her. Then she turned off the lamp on her bedside table and eventually drifted off to sleep. But just a few hours later, at 1:17 a.m., so this is now on January 25th, Peggy woke up startled. Her home phone was ringing on the bedside table right next to her, and the sound had pulled her out of her dream. She took a breath and got her bearings, and then leaned over and flipped the switch on the lamp. Peggy looked at the clock next to the phone and saw how late it was, and she started to panic because she was worried that a phone call at this hour could only mean something bad had happened. Peggy sat up in bed and cautiously answered the phone, and then after talking to the caller for about a minute, Peggy relaxed. Now, Peggy was still a bit shocked from getting a call in the middle of the night that woke her up, but there was no emergency or any bad news. Peggy just had a couple of unexpected late-night visitors standing outside of her house. So Peggy got out of her bed, she walked to her closet and put on her robe and slippers, then she headed downstairs and walked to the front door. She opened the door and smiled at the two people standing outside. But before she could let her visitors in, a loud, very high-pitched beeping sound began echoing through Peggy's house. Peggy had forgotten to turn off the house alarm before she opened the door. Peggy quickly punched in the code on the keypad right near the door, and it turned the alarm off, but the phone in the kitchen started ringing, so Peggy rushed to go grab it. The alarm company was calling to see if everything was okay, and Peggy would give them a password to let them know it really was her, and then she told them everything was fine. Then she hung up the phone and called out to her visitors to come inside. And they did. They joined Peggy in the kitchen, and she poured each of them a glass of water. Then the three of them sat at the kitchen table and talked for a few minutes, and then Peggy stood up and excused herself. Peggy walked through the living room and went up the stairs to the second-floor bathroom, which was a lot warmer than the one on the first floor. But when Peggy was done and about to leave the bathroom, she heard shouting outside and footsteps on the stairs. And so Peggy stepped out of the bathroom, and she was surprised to see her two visitors were standing right there outside. They were quiet and kind of awkward, and Peggy thought maybe the two of them were in the middle of some kind of argument that she had now just kind of butted herself into. But Peggy smiled at them and said, "Let's go down to the kitchen and keep on talking." Then Peggy walked past them, put her hand on the banister, and began walking down the steps. And the two visitors followed her. But before reaching the bottom of the stairs, Peggy heard one of her visitors begin to scream right behind her. Several hours later, at 9 a.m. on January 25th, so almost 8 hours after the visitors had arrived at Peggy's house, Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, stepped out of her car in front of Peggy's house. Suzanne was 55 years old with frizzy dyed blonde hair. She wore jeans, tennis shoes, a t-shirt, and a big winter coat. Suzanne had not inherited her mother's love of fashion. Instead, Suzanne preferred comfort over style. Suzanne walked quickly to the front door. It was bitterly cold out, but Suzanne barely noticed. She had woken up that morning and called her mother like she did almost every day, but Peggy hadn't answered. There was a chance Peggy could have just slept in or gone out to exercise, but Suzanne had tried calling back a little bit later, and Peggy still didn't answer. So Suzanne had called her sister-in-law, Diana, because she knew Diana usually called Peggy several times a day too, and Diana said she had called Peggy too at around 7:30 that morning, but Peggy didn't pick up, and so Diana said she left a message but still had not heard back yet. After talking to Diana, Suzanne was worried enough that she decided to just drive over to her mother's house to make sure everything was okay. Once Suzanne reached her mother's porch, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the key she had to her mother's house. She used it to open up the door, and then once she was inside, she called out for her mother, but there was no answer. So Suzanne began walking around the first floor of the house. And when Suzanne walked into the living room, she let out a blood-curdling scream. Suzanne saw Peggy's crumpled body on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Suzanne instinctively ran to her mother, and when she got a good look at her, she saw there was a knife sticking out of Peggy's chest. And so Suzanne dropped down and just yanked the knife out and threw it on the floor, and then she leaned in and touched her mother's face, and she could feel that Peggy's skin had gone totally ice cold. Totally distraught, Suzanne took out her cell phone and dialed 911. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Suzanne began yelling that she needed help and that her mother must have fallen down the stairs while holding a knife and she accidentally stabbed herself. Not long after the 911 call, Detectives Stephen Cole Hatchard and Earl Lawrence of the Clarkstown Police Department pulled up in a sedan outside of Peggy's house and stepped out of the car. The snow had started again, and they could feel the cold biting into their hands and faces. Local police had already run crime scene tape all across the front of Peggy's house, and some of Peggy's neighbors had already begun to gather nearby. Hatchard and Lawrence also saw Peggy's daughter, Suzanne, pacing back and forth in the driveway, a few feet in front of a uniformed police officer. Suzanne was mumbling to herself, and she looked totally dazed. The detectives approached Suzanne and introduced themselves, and Suzanne immediately repeated what she had said to the 911 operator. Her mother must have fallen down the stairs while she was holding a knife and accidentally stabbed herself. Suzanne said she had been worried about her mother on those stairs for a long time. But before the detectives could even really process what Suzanne was talking about, she would say something that sent up multiple red flags. Suzanne told Hatchard and Lawrence that police would likely find her fingerprints on the knife because she had pulled the knife out of her mother's chest before trying to administer CPR on her mother. And Suzanne said her fingerprints were all over the house because she went to visit her mom there all the time. But Suzanne didn't stop there. She just kept on talking. And she would tell the detectives that her mom was really rich, but she said this was not how she wanted to inherit her cut of her mom's estate. Detective Hatchard told Suzanne to wait with the officer outside and that they would talk to her once they had searched the house. Then Hatchard and Lawrence walked towards the front door while Suzanne began pacing in the driveway again. The detectives couldn't believe what they had just learned. They hadn't even stepped inside the house yet, but already Peggy's daughter had admitted to tampering with evidence by pulling the knife out of her mother's chest. Suzanne had also tried to cover for the fact that her fingerprints would be found on a potential weapon and throughout the house. And she had given a clear motive for possibly having killed her mother by talking about Peggy's money. That said, Hatchard and Lawrence knew that people under stress could act in strange ways, especially when dealing with the death of a loved one. But neither of them had ever encountered anything like what had just happened with Suzanne. It sort of seemed like she had worked up a big cover story and then blurted all of it out as soon as cops showed up. Inside the house, detectives Hatchard and Lawrence found a small group of forensics officers searching for fingerprints, blood samples, and other physical evidence. When the local police had first arrived on the scene, they really weren't sure what they were dealing with, or if Suzanne's story about her mom falling with the knife was true, so a forensics team and the detectives had been called in. But when Hatchard and Lawrence reached the bottom of Peggy's stairs, they didn't need forensics officers to tell them that Suzanne's version of what happened was totally off. On the ground in front of the detectives was Peggy Nadell. She was dead and lying face up on the floor. The detectives crouched down and right away saw multiple knife wounds in Peggy's chest, and they saw the knife that Suzanne said she had removed lying on the floor nearby. And when detectives looked more closely at Peggy's body, they began to notice wounds on the side of her head as though she had been struck with a blunt object several times. And right near Peggy's face was this small sculpture, which was the bust of someone's head, and then near Peggy's hand was a gold medal ball, another piece of art. And so maybe those two things were the blunt object that had been smashed into Peggy. Also, the detectives saw bruising around Peggy's neck and throat, which most likely indicated that Peggy had been strangled at some point. In short, there was no way Peggy had just tumbled down the stairs while holding a knife, and that was how she accidentally killed herself. Clearly, this was a murder. Hatchard and Lawrence were appalled by what they saw. Any violent crime was bad enough, but neither of them could understand what type of person would attack a defenseless 80-year-old woman. The detectives assumed Peggy must have been struck in the head with either the small sculpture or that golden ball that were laying close by her body, but forensics officers said no fingerprints or physical evidence had been found on either of those objects. It was like they had both been wiped clean. So the detectives stepped away from Peggy's body and walked upstairs and went to search Peggy's bedroom. In the bedroom, they saw a few dresser drawers were laid out on the floor, and there was an open jewelry box on top of the dresser. Someone had clearly rifled through the jewelry box, but it was still filled with several expensive pieces. Hatchard and Lawrence looked around the rest of the room, and when they were done with their cursory check, they both had the same thought. This was not a robbery. If anything, this was a weak attempt by Peggy's killer to make it look like a robbery. By 1 p.m., so about 4 hours after Suzanne made that 911 call, Hatchard and Lawrence had finished their initial search of the crime scene and had briefed their boss on what they had found. They weren't sure exactly what had happened in the house, but they knew there was only one place to start their investigation, and that was with Peggy's daughter, Suzanne. Later that afternoon, Hatchard and Lawrence sat in a comfortable police station conference room across a long table from Suzanne. They wanted Suzanne to be able to talk freely and feel comfortable, which is why they had not brought her into a cramped interrogation room. The detectives had not found any direct evidence to pin Peggy's murder on Suzanne, but they had heard Suzanne's bizarre statements she made at the house, and they felt like that was definitely enough to go on. Detective Hatchard started by asking Suzanne to explain why she had been at Peggy's house in the first place. Suzanne talked about not being able to get a hold of her mom and how her sister-in-law Diana had had the same issue, so Suzanne had gone by her mother's house to check on Peggy. After all, Peggy was 80 years old, she lived alone, so Suzanne checked on her a lot. That made total sense to Hatchard and Lawrence, but then Hatchard asked Suzanne why she had been so preoccupied with her fingerprints potentially being found on the knife. And Suzanne's answer to this seemed even weirder than some of the stuff she'd said at the house. Suzanne leaned across the table and told them she watched a lot of TV shows and news programs about murder, so she knew the cops would very likely be looking at Peggy's family members as suspects, and so she wanted to clear herself. Hatchard and Lawrence could tell Suzanne really believed saying this was actually going to help her, but they thought this made her look even more guilty. Here was a person who watched TV shows that demonstrated how law enforcement tracked down killers, and then she had taken steps like tampering with a murder weapon that could throw investigators off her trail. The detectives ended up questioning Suzanne for several hours that afternoon, and at the end of it, as far as the detectives were concerned, Suzanne had done nothing to clear herself of her mother's murder. During the interview, Suzanne seemed kind of erratic, and she kept bringing up her inheritance. She said her mom was worth about $4 million, and now that she was dead, Suzanne would get half of it. By the end of the interview, several police officers who were watching the interview thought Hatchard and Lawrence had gotten enough damning statements from Suzanne to actually put her in custody. But the detectives knew that if they did that, word would very quickly spread all across the area that Suzanne had been arrested for murdering her mother. And once that rumor was out there, people would have a really hard time ever changing their minds about what they thought Suzanne had done, even if it was proven later on that Suzanne was actually innocent. So Hatchard and Lawrence talked over their various options, and ultimately they just didn't feel like they had enough evidence yet to justify holding Suzanne and potentially destroying her reputation. So they let her go. But as soon as Suzanne was out of the police station, Hatchard and Lawrence called a judge and they got a warrant to conduct full-time surveillance on Suzanne. Police would get stationed outside of Suzanne's home and her work, and they would watch her at those two locations and follow her anytime she left them. In the following days, along with conducting their around-the-clock surveillance, investigators began digging into Suzanne's recent credit card history, and they found another huge red flag. On the night of January 24th, so just hours before Suzanne's mother would be killed, Suzanne had gone shopping at a grocery store that was close to Peggy's house. But based on her credit card records, this was not where Suzanne typically did her shopping. She went to a store that was much closer to her own home. But it was not just this grocery store's location that seemed kind of suspicious. On the night in question, investigators learned that Suzanne purchased rubber gloves and cleaning supplies. Hatchard and Lawrence felt like this was just one more thing that pointed towards Suzanne's guilt. After all, rubber gloves and cleaning supplies could explain why there were no fingerprints found at the crime scene. And so the detectives were confident they were on the right track, and they thought if Suzanne had killed her mother, she would slip up soon, and they would be there to arrest her. At 11 a.m. on January 29, 2014, 4 days after Peggy's murder, Suzanne sat in a wooden pew in a funeral home next to her husband. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her whole body felt like it was trembling. The pews around her were filled with Peggy's friends, family, and members of the Valley Cottage community who Peggy had gone out of her way to help. Even though police had not arrested Suzanne, word had already spread that she was a primary suspect. And a couple of days earlier, when Suzanne had gone to her mother's house to pick out clothes for her mother to be buried in, a neighbor had stepped outside. And this woman, who had known Suzanne since she was just a little girl, began screaming, "When are you going to arrest her?" And so the rumors and the pressure were really starting to get to Suzanne, and it was making it hard to sleep at night. Towards the end of the service, Suzanne and others recited a prayer in Hebrew, and then Suzanne quickly made her way out of the funeral home. Once outside, Suzanne welcomed the fresh, cold air. It was like she could breathe again. Inside, she'd felt stifled because she felt like everybody was staring at her and talking about her. A minute later, Suzanne's younger brother Jim and his wife Diana came outside and walked over to her. They had flown in from Florida shortly after they learned about Peggy's death, and Suzanne could not have been happier they were here. Suzanne said hello to her brother, who she always thought was kind of strange, and then she hugged Diana, who she was very close with, and they talked for a while about how much Peggy had meant to them. But as they stood there chatting, they had no idea the police were watching. Not long after Peggy's funeral, Detectives Hatchard and Lawrence met with Suzanne's brother Jim and his wife Diana at the police station. The detectives asked them basic questions, like where they had been on the night before the murder. Jim had been at his house in Florida, and Diana had been at a wedding most of the day. Diana would say that she had called Peggy on the morning of the murder, but didn't get an answer. And then she also said she'd spoken to Suzanne right before Suzanne had gone to Peggy's house and discovered Peggy's body. Hatchard and Lawrence would, of course, follow up on Jim and Diana's statements, but the detectives really wanted information on Suzanne. They wanted to know if Suzanne had spoken to Jim and Diana about the inheritance money that Suzanne seemed so eager to tell police about. But Diana said the idea that Suzanne had anything to do with this murder was ridiculous. She said Suzanne loved her mom, and she was closer to Peggy than basically anybody else in the world. And so Diana said the police really needed to stop wasting their time looking at Suzanne and bring the person who actually killed Peggy to justice. But when Jim and Diana left the police station after their interview, the detectives still totally believed Suzanne was their most likely suspect. Family members sticking up for each other was not anything new. But over the next few weeks, surveillance on Suzanne did not get Hatchard and Lawrence any closer to having concrete evidence that she was in fact the killer. Still, Hatchard and Lawrence hoped that even if Suzanne's actions didn't lead them anywhere, that maybe her phone records soon would. Investigator Robin Arias sat at her desk staring at hundreds of numbers printed on a piece of paper. Most people's eyes would probably have glazed over, staring at all those numbers for as long as Arias had, but she could feel her pulse racing as she scanned the sheet of paper over and over. Arias was an investigator with the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, and she was an expert at analyzing phone data. Arias had begun working with Detectives Hatchard and Lawrence on Peggy's murder case, and currently she was studying calls that Suzanne made, and she was also looking at Peggy's phone records. Arias confirmed that Suzanne called Peggy multiple times before calling 911 on the morning of the murder. Arias also confirmed that Diana had also called Peggy and had spoken to Suzanne on that same morning. But now there was something on one of the sheets of paper, something from Peggy's phone records, that really leapt out at Arias. She could see that someone had called Peggy at exactly 1:17 a.m. on the morning of the murder. And this was a big deal because that time was basically right before Peggy was killed. But there was something else that struck Arias as odd about this call. The call had come from a number that didn't show up anywhere else in Peggy's phone records. Arias was checking the records to make sure she was right, but she was convinced that that late-night call was made by someone that Peggy did not normally speak to. And so finally, after scanning the pages several more times, Arias was sure she was right about that phone number, that it was really unique. So she grabbed her own phone and she made a few calls. Detective Hatchard was at his desk going over notes from Peggy's murder case when Arias called him. And as soon as Hatchard answered, he could tell Arias had big news. She was known to be very calm, cool, and collected basically all the time, but immediately Hatchard could hear the excitement in Arias's voice. Arias told Hatchard about the strange number that had popped up in Peggy's phone records just before her murder. But Arias said this was just the tip of the iceberg. She looked into that number and learned that it came from a phone that was not actually registered to anyone. It was something called a burner phone. A burner phone is typically a cheap cell phone that's purchased just for temporary use or to keep the user's identity anonymous. Hatchard listened to Arias, and he felt like she had just helped the investigation take a huge step forward. But then, Arias gave him the most important piece of information of all. Arias had worked for hours and hours and pulled some strings, and she had figured out where this burner phone had been purchased from and who had bought it. Hatchard thanked Arias profusely for all her help, then he hung up the phone and rushed over to Lawrence's desk to tell him what he just learned. It would take the detectives a while to follow up on all the information Arias had provided them, but once they had gone through all of it, they would figure out who killed Peggy. Based on Robin Arias's phone data analysis, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe occurred in the early morning hours of January 25, 2014, when someone murdered Peggy Nadell in the home she had lived in for 50 years. On that day, just after 1 a.m., the killers, plural, drove through the town center of Valley Cottage. And there was something about the place that almost didn't seem real, like it was a movie set version of a perfect small town. The killers looked at each other, but didn't speak. They knew what they were about to do would leave this entire community in complete shock. A few minutes later, the driver pulled onto Peggy's street and then parked in front of Peggy's large gray house. A few porch lights were on at some of the nearby houses, but overall, the neighborhood was totally quiet. In the car, the passenger reached into their pocket, took out a phone, and called Peggy's home phone number. This was the call that came through at 1:17 a.m. The passenger's voice was bright and cheery when Peggy picked up on the other line. The passenger said they were so sorry to call late, but they had been in the neighborhood and they really needed to come in and talk to Peggy face-to-face about something. Peggy seemed frazzled, but she said to give her a few minutes to pull herself together and she'd come downstairs and let them in. The passenger hung up and then handed the phone to the driver, who slipped it into their pocket. Then the passenger reached down into a bag that was on the floorboard and pulled out 2 pairs of gloves and handed one of the pairs to the driver. Both killers put the gloves into their coat pockets. Then the driver reached into the back seat and grabbed a small leather bag that had a strap on it, and the driver slung that bag over their shoulder. The killers then looked at each other and then stepped out of the car into the frigid winter air and began walking across the yard towards Peggy's front door. As soon as they reached the front door, Peggy opened it up with a big smile on her face. But before the killers could step inside, Peggy's alarm system went off and the phone in the kitchen began to ring. The killers waited while Peggy dealt with the alarm company, and then they walked into the house and joined Peggy in the kitchen. The killers sat down at the table, and Peggy brought them some water. They all sat and talked for a few minutes before Peggy said she had to go use the bathroom and headed upstairs. While Peggy was upstairs, one of the killers, the passenger in the car, said it was time to act, and that the driver needed to be the one to actually do the job on their own. But the driver said no, they both needed to do it to make sure Peggy didn't fight back. But the passenger just barked back that, come on, Peggy's an old woman, it won't take 2 people, and pretty soon the 2 killers were basically shouting at each other. But quickly they stopped because they did know they did need to act soon, and ultimately they agreed they would do it together. So the killers slipped on their gloves, and the driver took the leather strap off of their bag, and then the killers ran out of the kitchen, through the living room, and up the stairs. But when Peggy walked out of the bathroom and saw them, the killers just kind of froze there, staring up at her awkwardly. Peggy smiled at them and didn't really know what to make of this, so she walked past them and just began walking down the stairs, and the killers followed her. But as they were going down the stairs, the killers knew that if they were going to do it, they needed to do it right now. So the driver just suddenly screamed and rushed Peggy from behind and wrapped that leather strap from the bag around Peggy's throat. Peggy and the driver stumbled down the stairs and hit the floor on the first floor, and the driver just kept pulling that leather strap tighter and tighter, strangling Peggy, but Peggy was somehow managing to put up a pretty good fight. The driver began to yell in frustration that this woman won't die, so the passenger ran into the living room and grabbed 2 pieces of art, a small bust of a person and a gold medal ball. And the passenger ran back to the stairs with these objects in their hands. When the driver saw the passenger carrying these weapons, the driver let go of their stranglehold on Peggy and kind of backed away. And then the passenger kind of looked at the 2 objects in their hands and dropped the lighter gold ball onto the floor, opting to use the bust instead. Then the passenger got down on their knees, held up the small statue, and began slamming it over and over again into the side of Peggy's head. Blood spilled from the wound, and Peggy flopped over onto her back. Eventually, the passenger dropped the statue on the floor and backed away. And as the killers stood there staring at their victim, they began to hear breathing still rattling from Peggy's chest. So, without hesitation, the passenger ran to the kitchen, threw open a drawer, and grabbed a large kitchen knife. Seconds later, the passenger ran back to the base of the stairs. They got down on top of Peggy and just began stabbing her over and over and over again in the chest until Peggy stopped breathing, went limp, and died. The passenger just left the knife plunged into Peggy's chest, and then the passenger stood up, and the two killers ran back to the kitchen, where they grabbed their cleaning supplies, and they wiped down their water glasses, and then they ran back over to the foot of the stairs, and they cleaned off the statue that had been used to bludgeon Peggy. They also wiped down the knife handle and the gold medal ball. Then the killers went upstairs to Peggy's room, and there they put a couple of dresser drawers out on the floor and took a few pieces of jewelry from a jewelry box in an attempt to make it look like Peggy's murder had just been the result of a robbery. Satisfied with their work, the killers walked downstairs, stepped over Peggy's body, went outside, and got back into their car. The passenger then told the driver to dispose of that burner phone and also dispose of the leather strap they had used to strangle Peggy. The driver said they would, and then the pair drove off. Several hours later, the passenger killer was heading to an airport in Washington, D.C. when their phone rang. It was their sister-in-law calling. The passenger answered the phone and then told their sister-in-law that they too had called Peggy earlier that morning, but Peggy hadn't answered and they had no idea why. It would turn out Suzanne had nothing to do with her mother's murder. But Suzanne's sister-in-law, so Peggy's own daughter-in-law, Diana, did murder Peggy. Suzanne's strange behavior following her mother's murder had most likely been a combination of grief and shock, and the fact that Suzanne had bought rubber gloves and cleaning supplies just hours before the murder was nothing more than a truly unfortunate coincidence. But it turned out that Suzanne was not the only person in the family who had spent time thinking about the millions of dollars in inheritance money that would come their way if Peggy died. Diana had thought about that money a lot, and she knew that her family would get $2 million, so half of Peggy's wealth, when Peggy was dead. But there was a catch. Diana had discovered that Peggy stipulated in her will that Diana would get nothing if she and Jim, so Peggy's son, got divorced. And Diana had badly wanted to divorce Jim. But when Diana had learned about Peggy's will and that stipulation, she realized she had to make sure Jim got a share of Peggy's money before she left Jim. Then, once Jim had his millions, Diana could get her cut through a divorce settlement. So Diana had spent weeks putting together her plan to have Peggy murdered. And then she had paid someone to come on as a partner to help her set everything up. The plan Diana conceived was purposefully convoluted, because she thought that would throw police off of her scent. But the phone records, and specifically her use of the burner phone, had allowed investigators to totally unravel Diana's plan. Phone data analyst Robin Arias had discovered the use of the burner phone and had tracked its purchase to a shop in Florida just minutes away from where Diana lived. It turned out Diana had not been the one who actually physically bought the phone, but using surveillance footage, investigators were able to track down the woman who had bought the phone. And when police questioned that woman, she said Diana had paid her money to buy the burner and hand it over. And so with the burner in her possession, Diana had told her family, and later had told police, that she flew to Washington, D.C. for a wedding. But in reality, Diana had flown to D.C. to meet a woman who had been recruited by Diana's partner to actually carry out the murder for $10,000. That woman met Diana at the airport in D.C., and they both drove several hours to New York to kill Peggy. Police believe Diana really wanted this woman to kill Peggy on her own, while Diana just supervised. That way she wouldn't have to actually murder her mother-in-law, who she had been close with for years. But in the heat of the moment, when the hired killer, or the driver, failed to strangle Peggy to death, Diana, who had been the passenger in the car, had acted on instinct and bludgeoned Peggy and then stabbed her to death. Diana believed that involving other people to set up and carry out this murder would help distance herself from the crime and maybe keep her out of trouble. But as investigators put together all the puzzle pieces, everybody else involved in this crime pointed the finger directly at Diana. The woman who was hired to kill Peggy for money and who tried unsuccessfully to strangle Peggy to death cut a plea deal and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. And while she was awaiting her murder trial in prison, Diana was recorded making phone calls trying to arrange the murders of 2 witnesses who could testify against her. Diana was found guilty of plotting to murder those witnesses, and as a result was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Then she was also found guilty of second-degree murder in Peggy's case and received an additional sentence of 23 years to life in prison. Peggy is buried outside of the small, quaint town where she spent 50 years of her life. With all of the things that Peggy accomplished in her career and her education, there was still just one thing that mattered to her above everything else: her own family. And so Peggy's headstone is very simple. It just says wife, mother, grandmother. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. You think you're safe when you're at home, but today's two stories prove you might not be. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Who's Out There? And it's about a woman's worst nightmare that unfolds at a cabin in the woods. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Denver Spider-Man, and it's about a very unsettling secret that was found inside of a locked house. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button is looking to adopt a pet, tell them you just rescued a puppy and you'd love for them to take it. But don't tell them when you say puppy, you actually mean enormous saltwater crocodile. Okay, let's get into our first story called Who's Out There? On the night of October 17th, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late. It was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half-mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. She was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because, just a few months earlier when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo, and so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious, and so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk. But Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark, winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these two eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the two eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash, they turned around, and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with two functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through. But because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there. And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you. But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. And then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911 and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something. And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. and she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on, and she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend, and so she called her boyfriend, and as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion and then coming back in, hearing the sound and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, "Look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go." And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, "Thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police." And so the friend said, "Okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police." And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house, and she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, "Hey, sorry, there is no issue here. Don't call the police." But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point. Then her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, "What's going on? What's going on?" And all Ada could think to do was yell out, "There's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them." And the friend is screaming, "I'm gonna call the police." And then the line goes dead. And Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up. The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least two gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. There were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing. And Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. There were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go, she must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication, but after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog to clear her head and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert. which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her. And then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection, but again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state, and so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her, but again, it's just her reflection. And so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person, and then didn't see anybody, and then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers. And then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground, and then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind. The next and final story of today's episode is called Denver Spider-Man. On October 17, 1941, 73-year-old Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for dinner, but he never showed up. His neighbors knew Phil was living alone at the time because his wife had recently fallen and broken her hip and was in the hospital. And so they were worried about Phil being on his own, and they thought, you know what, let's just be sure, let's call the police and have them go over and check on him. When the police arrived at his house, they knocked on the door, no answer. They tried the door handle, it was locked. They tried the other door, that was locked too. They looked in the windows, it was all dark, and they had to get another neighbor who had a key to open the door for them. When they stepped inside, there was blood everywhere. Walls, on the ceiling, everywhere. And in the middle of the kitchen is Phil Peters, face down. He has been bludgeoned to death. The police immediately draw their weapons and they're looking around the house thinking someone could still be here. And they clear the whole house and there's no one there. And so a whole bunch of detectives converge on the house and they start investigating. And they realize pretty quickly how strange the scene was. Nothing in the house was vandalized, nothing in the house was stolen, and Phil himself was just a very modest, retired auditor. He certainly didn't have any enemies, and so the revenge angle didn't necessarily make much sense. But then you gotta remember that when police first got there before they discovered his body, the house was shut and locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. And so whoever was in there with Phil at the time of his death must have known Phil enough to have a key of their own or have Phil open the door for them. So it made investigators wonder what would motivate some person that's in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous crime when the obvious angles such as theft, vandalism, revenge have basically been crossed off. Not to mention there was virtually no evidence of who could have done this, with the exception of the murder weapon, which was this big piece of metal called a stove shaker. But the person who had used it to kill him had taken the time to meticulously wipe it off. So there was nothing on it, no fingerprints, no anything. So for months, detectives agonized over this case, but they got nowhere. 9 months later, a housekeeper was hired by Phil's widow to help around the house now that Phil was gone. And she said as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but didn't think anything of it. And so that day, the day she's calling police, she's alone in the Peters residence and she hears the tapping and it's coming from the kitchen. And she thinks, oh, it's got to be a woodpecker just outside the house, outside the window. And she said as she looked into the kitchen, on the other side of the kitchen was a door that opened up to a flight of stairs that went to the second floor. And she said it was slowly opening. And out from behind comes this white hand that reaches for the side of the door and begins to pull it open. And she screams, and the hand retracts back into the space. And then she hears it storm up the stairs and run around on the upstairs before going silent again. She ran out of the house and she ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately go to the house and they go inside, guns drawn, and they're looking for this person because they're thinking perhaps the murderer is back. And they're looking all through the house and there's nothing. There's not even a sign of a break-in. And so the police go back to the housekeeper and to Miss Peters. They explain that we couldn't find anyone, but given the history of your house, we don't think it's safe for you to be in there. And so the housekeeper didn't go back, and Miss Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be looked after during the police investigation. At this point, the police decide we're going to permanently stake out this house. We're going to have 2 detectives that are outside this house watching it at all times. And so 2 detectives go and they're sitting outside, and for a couple of days, they're not seeing anything. They're not hearing anything. And they decide to just go inside and have a look around. They both walk into the house, they go upstairs, they look around, they don't see anything, they go back downstairs. And as they're standing on the first floor getting ready to leave, they hear what sounds like a doorknob turning upstairs. They both heard it, so they go upstairs and they start searching different rooms. And one of the detectives goes into the bedroom and opens up a closet, and past all the clothes, bottom left-hand corner, he sees a foot dart into a little space in the back corner of the closet. And without any hesitation, this guy jumps head first into the closet and grabs the foot of this mystery person who's crawling into a tiny little panel in the back of a closet. And he holds on to this person who's fighting with their life to get away, and he starts pulling them out, and he's yelling for his partner to come over. He comes charging in, they both grab this person and they yank this person out, and they would describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall but rail thin, and his skin was so dirty it appeared gray. His name was Theodore Coneys, and he had been living in this house for a year. Before Coneys moved in, he had fallen on hard times, he was sleeping in alleyways, and as it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime friend, Phil Peters, and he would ask him for some money and maybe an opportunity to crash at his house for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. Phil was at the hospital visiting his wife who had a broken hip, and so the house was vacant. And Coneys saw an opportunity and he broke in. And at first, his plan was just to steal food, get warmed up a little bit, and then leave. But he noticed when he was looking through the house for things to take, that in the back of one of these closets was a panel that led to this tiny little, almost secret attic space that wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You'd have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that would bring you into this little space. And then once you got in, you could only get in by slithering head first in. You couldn't stand up. You had to be laying the entire time. You couldn't extend your legs all the way if you're a full-grown adult. So you're kind of tucked up in almost like a pseudo-fetal position. But Coneys saw this as a huge upgrade from living on the streets, and he decided that this is where he's going to live for the winter. And so he went around the house gathering supplies between blankets and food and water, and he filled his tiny little space. And then he went back downstairs and he locked the front door again, made sure everything looked the way it was when he showed up. And he went into his little space and shut the door behind him. And when Phil came home that night, he didn't notice anything. And for the next several weeks, Phil never noticed a thing. Every time Phil would leave, Coneys would sneak out, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, and then go back up to his little space. He even cut into the house's wiring system and stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into the cubby with him, attached it to the new wiring, and he got to listen to the news so he didn't feel so isolated from the outside world. But about a month later, Coneys leaves his little spot to go downstairs because he thinks Phil is gone. He gets to the kitchen, he's going through the fridge. When he shuts the fridge, he looks over and there's Phil standing there looking at him like, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" In a panic, Coneys grabs the stove shaker and beats Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wipes off the murder weapon, leaves it where it is. He goes in the fridge, he gets some more food and drink, and he goes right back up to where he lives. He would follow the investigation of Phil Peters' death on his radio curled up inside of Phil Peters' house. Coneys was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him, he says out loud, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Just after 1:30 in the morning on May 12, 1994, a young girl ran out the front door of her home in rural Maine out into the rainy night. Barefoot and terrified, the girl went door to door screaming for help, but no one heard her. Finally, after running nearly 2 miles in the dead of night, she arrived in her little downtown and managed to flag down a restaurant owner. The owner would help the girl call 911, and within minutes, the police would arrive at that young girl's home. And what they would discover there was one of the most horrific crimes ever committed in that small town. Not only because of its sheer brutality, but also because of who committed it and why. We tried to make this story make sense, but sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please delete all the music off of the Amazon Music follow button's phone and replace it with every episode of the brand new Ballen Studios podcast, Bedtime Stories. Just search for Ballen Studios and then look for Bedtime Stories on Amazon Music. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 23, 1993, Crystal Perry got ready for work in the bedroom of her small white wooden house in Bridgeton, Maine. And she was excited because it was her 30th birthday. Crystal was very attractive with pale freckled skin, light blue eyes, and thick, bright red hair. Her hair actually was so bright that it made her almost immediately recognizable wherever she went in her small town. And on the rare occasions when Crystal went out to a bar or went dancing with her friends, her looks made her the center of attention. Or they made her an object of desire for men watching her from a distance who couldn't get the nerve up to go talk to her. In her bedroom, Crystal finished getting dressed for work, and then she called out to her 11-year-old daughter, Sarah, to let her know it was time to go. But Sarah was already standing behind her mom, and she shouted, "Happy birthday!" Crystal was startled, but she turned around and gave Sarah a big hug. Crystal had only been 18 years old when Sarah was born, and she had actually only been 15 years old when she married Sarah's father. At such a young age, Crystal's parents had to give their legal permission for the marriage to take place. But the marriage didn't last, and Crystal had gotten divorced when Sarah was a little girl. Since then, Crystal and Sarah had pretty much been on their own, and they were as close as a mother and daughter could get. They spent almost every night together watching movies, reading books, and talking and laughing in their house. Even as Sarah got older, Crystal still made it a point to tuck her in before bed, and sometimes she would even sing to her until she fell asleep. And on that morning of her 30th birthday, Crystal was heading out to her job at a local shoe factory that she had only taken just so she could make enough money to afford the little house where she and her daughter lived. The work Crystal did, sewing parts of shoes by hand, was totally backbreaking, and she would come home from work at night feeling totally tired and smelling of chemicals from the factory. But Crystal thought the long hours and hard work was all worth it because Sarah had a home and a room of her own. Crystal and Sarah walked outside, they got into Crystal's car in the driveway, and drove down the road through Brighton. Their house was secluded and surrounded by woods, and there were only a few houses nearby. But after a short drive, they pulled up to the house of a family friend where Sarah was going to spend the day. Crystal gave her daughter a kiss, told her she loved her, and then waved goodbye as Sarah walked up to the house. Then Crystal drove off and headed to work. When Crystal was a few minutes away from the shoe factory, she slowed down and stared out the windshield. There were these black balloons tied to a telephone pole. It was a weird sight, and Crystal didn't know what the balloons were for. And then things got even weirder when she saw more black balloons tied to telephone poles at regular intervals along the road. Then, when she was just outside of work, she saw even more black balloons, but this time they were attached to a huge sign that said, "Happy 30th, Crystal." Crystal nearly slammed on her brakes, and she almost started crying out of happiness. She couldn't believe her friends and coworkers had taken the time to set all this up just to make her feel special on her birthday. Then she started laughing when she realized they'd chosen black balloons because she was 30 years old now. Crystal parked her car and walked into work, and there were even more balloons and signs waiting for her. And that day, they had a huge party for her at the factory, but that was just the beginning of Crystal's birthday celebration. That night at the house, Crystal made dinner, and Sarah set the table. Crystal's boyfriend, Dennis Butler, was on his way over to join them for Crystal's birthday dinner, and Sarah was very excited. She liked Dennis because he was funny and nice to her, and he didn't talk to her like she was a little kid. Crystal was happy that Dennis was good with Sarah, and that Sarah liked him, but Crystal still wasn't sure about her own relationship with Dennis. Dennis was about to turn 20 years old, but he worked full-time, and he'd actually already been married before, so he seemed older than he was. But Crystal still just felt totally strange about the 10-year age gap between them. Still, Crystal and Dennis always had a good time together, and she knew finding the right guy in a small town wasn't always easy. The tourists who came to Bridgeton, Maine from all across New England saw it as a quaint little city with stunning natural beauty and charming shops and restaurants. But the people who lived there knew there was actually a side of the town that the tourists did not see. Drug use and drug dealing had been a problem in the area for years. In fact, one of Dennis's old high school classmates who lived not too far from Crystal, a guy named Michael Hutchinson, was known to show up to bars in town or just to walk around the streets totally high on cocaine. So, as Crystal put the finishing touches on dinner, she told herself that at least Dennis had not fallen into that kind of lifestyle. And it was her birthday, so she just wanted to be happy and have a good time and not spend the night worrying about her future with Dennis. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the front door, and so Sarah walked across the linoleum kitchen floor, went through the small living room, and opened the door, and there was Dennis. Dennis said hello to Sarah and gave her a big hug, and then he shouted happy birthday to Crystal. Dennis was tall and thin with dark hair and a square jaw, and he wore a gold earring in one of his ears. He went into the kitchen, gave Crystal a kiss, and then handed her a birthday card and a present. And a few minutes later, Crystal, Sarah, and Dennis sat down at the kitchen table and had dinner, and then they ate the birthday cake. After dinner and cake, Sarah helped her mom clear the dishes and put them in the sink. Then she handed her mom a small box with a bow on it. Crystal opened the present, and right away she got choked up. Sarah had gotten her this little pewter figurine of a warrior woman holding a sword, a perfect symbol of a single mother who fought as hard as she could to take care of her daughter. The three of them went into the living room and talked for a while. Then at some point, Sarah felt tired, so she got up, said goodnight to her mom and Dennis, and headed up to her bedroom. Crystal didn't tuck Sarah in that night because she stayed on the couch talking to Dennis. And so Sarah lay in bed thinking that Dennis and her mom might get married soon, and the thought of that made her happy. But as Sarah began to drift off to sleep, she began hearing yelling from the living room. And not long after that, Sarah heard the front door slam shut. And then she heard Dennis's car screeching out of the driveway. Sarah had no idea what had happened, but it obviously sounded bad, but she just stayed there in bed and tried to go to sleep. Crystal sat in the living room, crying on the couch. Her perfect birthday had fallen apart because Dennis had flown off the handle and gotten totally upset with her. She didn't actually know why he'd gotten upset. Maybe it was because she mentioned that she was not sure about their future, or maybe it was something Crystal wasn't even aware of. But the reason for the outburst didn't really matter to Crystal, because when Dennis had gotten angry, he got loud and scary. And she decided that was not the kind of guy she wanted around her daughter anymore. And so, before Dennis had stormed out of the house, Crystal had made it clear to him that their relationship was over. Crystal wiped the tears from her eyes, went to her room, and got ready for bed. Then she climbed under the covers and stared up at the ceiling. She knew the black balloons her friends and coworkers had gotten her for her birthday had been a joke, but for the first time, Crystal really did feel old. However, she hoped, now that she was 30, that her life would get a little calmer and easier, and that she wouldn't have any more nights that ended in shouting matches. But not long after Crystal's 30th birthday, for reasons even Crystal couldn't totally figure out, Crystal let Dennis right back into her life. Dennis spent the next several months trying to convince Crystal to put their past arguments behind them. He worked hard to prove that she could trust him, and he did everything he could to win her back. And Sarah found herself hoping that her mom and Dennis would make things work and stay together for good this time. And eventually, Dennis proposed to Crystal, and Crystal said yes. And for a time after the proposal, Crystal and Sarah thought their lives were about to change for good. And, along with Dennis, they would become this happy, loving family. On the night of May 11th, 1994, so 9 months after Crystal's 30th birthday, Crystal sat at the foot of Sarah's bed. Sarah was 12 years old now, but she still liked talking to her mom every night before she went to sleep. And for the past few weeks, Sarah had felt like she was comforting Crystal more than Crystal was comforting her when they talked at night. Because even though Crystal and Dennis were still engaged, their relationship had taken a bad turn again. They had started getting on each other's nerves again, and there were lots of nights that Sarah fell asleep listening to the sound of them screaming at each other in the living room. And there were other nights when Dennis was not at the house that the phone would ring, Crystal would answer, and she would hear screaming on the other line, and so she would just hang up. Sarah knew her mom was worried about the arguments and the angry phone calls, but whenever the mother and daughter were together, Crystal never let on that she was upset. She was always very positive and upbeat around her daughter. Crystal thought that no matter what happened with her and Dennis, that she and Sarah would be just fine. In the bedroom, Crystal said goodnight to Sarah, kissed her on the forehead, turned off the light, and walked out of the room. She went to her own bedroom, got undressed, and slipped on a blue terry cloth robe. Then she went to the living room, picked up a book, sat down on the couch, and started to read. Crystal could hear the rain falling on the roof. She loved that sound. It made her feel relaxed and safe somehow, like the rain would let her hide away from the rest of the world. But after midnight on May 12th, there was a sudden knock at the front door. Crystal put her book down and quickly walked across the living room. She didn't know who was there, but she didn't want their knocking to wake up her daughter. Crystal opened up the door just a little bit, and then she and the person standing outside talked briefly. Then Crystal smiled, opened the door wide, and let the visitor into the house. Just before 1 a.m., so less than an hour after this visitor had knocked on the door and come inside, Sarah woke up in her bed. She heard shouting coming from the kitchen, and so she figured her mom must be in another fight with Dennis. So Sarah closed her eyes and tried to go back to sleep. But then Sarah heard her mom scream, "No!" over and over and over. Sarah got scared and yelled to her mom, but Crystal just kept screaming, "No, no!" from the kitchen. Sarah immediately got out of bed and grabbed her white terry cloth robe that was similar to her mom's, put it on over her pajamas, and crept across her room to the door as quietly as possible. She wanted to help her mom, but she didn't know what to do, so she just crouched there by the door and listened. Then she heard something like boots stomping in the kitchen, and she heard a loud crash like something had fallen onto the floor. Sarah stayed in her room, too terrified to move. Then the house fell silent, and she thought about running out of her room, but suddenly she heard footsteps in the kitchen again, so she kept waiting inside of her bedroom by the door. Minutes later, Sarah heard the sound of the front door opening and shutting, and then there was no more sound coming from the living room or the kitchen. So Sarah stood up, flung her door open, and ran from her bedroom to the front of the house. She looked into the kitchen, and she screamed. Sarah saw her mother lying on the kitchen floor. There was blood on her robe and her legs, and near her was the phone that was off the hook. Sarah began yelling for her mother, but Crystal didn't respond. So Sarah grabbed the phone and tried 911, but the phone wasn't working. It just kept on beeping. So Sarah dropped the phone, ran out of the kitchen and out the front door into the rain. She felt wet grass and mud on her bare feet as she turned up the road and ran towards her closest neighbor's house. When she got there, Sarah rushed up to her neighbor's door and started knocking and screaming, but there was no movement inside and nobody answered the door. So Sarah turned and ran to the house across the street. She was cold, her robe was soaked, and her feet were caked in mud. She banged on the door as hard as she could and she waited, but again nobody answered the door. So Sarah turned again up the road and started running into town. By this point, her legs were burning and she was totally out of breath. Sometime after about 1:30 in the morning, after Sarah had run for about 1.5 miles in the rain, she made it into town. She saw a light on inside a small Italian restaurant, so she ran to the restaurant door and started pounding on it. Then she noticed a light go on in the small apartment above the restaurant where the owners lived. And a few seconds later, a man and a woman, the restaurant owners, opened the door. The woman looked totally shocked when she saw Sarah standing there in the rain covered in mud. The woman wrapped her arms around Sarah and brought her into the restaurant. The owners asked what was going on, and Sarah said her mother had just been attacked at their home. The man took Sarah's hand and led her to the phone, while the woman went back upstairs to get Sarah a blanket and dry clothes. The man dialed 911 and told the operator that he needed police assistance immediately and then handed the phone to Sarah. And then Sarah spoke as clearly as she could and told the operator that her mom was at her house and that she was hurt and that there was blood everywhere. A few minutes after the 911 call, Detective Dick Pickett of the Maine State Police drove down a dark, rural stretch of road toward Crystal and Sarah's home. The rain was still falling, and even with the moon shining, visibility wasn't great. But Pickett saw the flashing lights of an ambulance, so he was able to find his way to the small white wooden house nestled in the trees. Pickett parked his car and stepped outside onto the wet, muddy ground. He was about average height, his brown hair was starting to thin, and he wore glasses. He walked into the house and he saw paramedics in the kitchen, but they had already pronounced Crystal Perry, the victim, dead at the scene. So Pickett walked over to Crystal's body. Pickett knew that small Maine towns might not be as picture-perfect as the tourists thought, but he was still shocked at what he saw, and he knew immediately that the news of this crime would cause fear and panic throughout Bridgeton. Pickett couldn't get over the amount of violence that had obviously taken place in this kitchen. His first thought was that this had to have been a crime of passion, carried out by someone who knew Crystal intimately, and whoever had done this had left a huge mess behind. There were bloody boot prints leading from the kitchen to the front door, and there was blood spatter all over the walls and kitchen counters. Soon after Pickett arrived, he was joined by several other state and local police officers and a state forensics team. Pickett led a few of the other officers on a sweep of the house, and they found their way into Sarah's bedroom, where they found the room was totally undisturbed, and there were even a few stuffed animals perfectly placed around the room where Sarah liked to keep them. After the 911 call, an ambulance had been dispatched to the Italian restaurant, and Sarah had been taken to the hospital. Pickett knew he would have to talk to her, but he couldn't imagine what that little girl was feeling at this moment. Pickett and the others checked Crystal's room next, but it also looked like it hadn't been disturbed. So Pickett believed whatever had happened to Crystal only took place in the living room and the kitchen. He walked back towards the kitchen and saw a photographer taking pictures of the scene and forensics officers studying the bloody boot prints on the floors. They hadn't found a murder weapon yet, but they still had plenty of evidence to work with. And Pickett saw a forensics officer crouched over Crystal's body, and she was fixated on one of Crystal's legs. She called Pickett and other forensics officers over, and she pointed to a small drop of blood on Crystal's leg that was almost a perfect circle. Pickett asked why that particular drop of blood was any different than the rest of the blood on Crystal's legs. The forensics officer looked up at him, pointed at the drop of blood again, and said they needed to take a sample of it, because she knew a drop like that had to be what was known as a passive blood drop. That meant it did not come from Crystal. And in this particular case, the forensics officer said the blood could have only dripped off of someone who was standing right over Crystal and fallen onto her body after she was already dead. So the forensics officer was pretty confident that that drop of blood belonged to Crystal's killer. The forensics team took the blood sample and gathered other blood samples from around the room. But Pickett knew testing them would take time, and having DNA from a blood sample didn't mean authorities would necessarily be able to match it to anyone. So Pickett called his investigative team together. He said he knew it was late, but he wanted to work fast and he wanted to work smart. He sent members of the team out in the middle of the night to see if they could track down and interview Crystal's neighbors, friends, and family. And within a couple of hours, Pickett got news that set the investigation in motion. One of Crystal's friends had told police that 2 weeks earlier, Crystal's fiancé, Dennis, had shown up to Crystal's house waving a knife around and threatening to kill her. At 4 a.m., 2.5 hours after police arrived at Crystal's house, Detective Pickett and 3 other officers knocked on the door of Dennis's parents' house where Dennis was staying. It took a few minutes, but Dennis finally answered and let the police inside. Pickett asked Dennis if he had seen Crystal that night, and then Dennis did something that kind of stunned all of the officers. Instead of answering the question, Dennis started pacing the room and he turned to the cops and asked, "Is Crystal dead?" And as soon as that happened, the police decided they really needed to bring Dennis in right away for questioning. A little later that morning, Dennis sat across from Pickett and the other members of the investigative team in a small, cramped police interrogation room. Pickett didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He told Dennis that in the few hours since they had found Crystal's body, they had already learned that she and Dennis had a pretty rough relationship and that Dennis was known to have a temper and to get aggressive. Dennis admitted that things were bad between him and Crystal, but that didn't mean he was a killer. He said a lot of couples yell and scream at each other when they argue. Then, in a calm voice, Pickett asked if Dennis was at all responsible for Crystal's death, and Dennis said no. But then, Dennis started shaking, almost like he was having convulsions. Every cop in the room had seen suspects get nervous and have trouble staying still during interrogations, but none of them had seen anything like this before. They got Dennis calmed down and made sure he was physically okay. Then they asked him if he'd be willing to submit samples for DNA testing. Then Dennis steadied himself and said he would. After hours with the police, Dennis left the station, and Pickett thought there was a good chance that once the test results came in, Dennis's DNA would match the DNA from the drop of blood the forensics team had taken from Crystal's leg and from other similar drops they had found in the kitchen. So Pickett thought there was a pretty good chance he'd be able to close this case quickly. On the afternoon of May 12th, so a few hours after police had questioned Dennis, Detective Pickett and another officer walked into a small bedroom inside of Sarah's grandmother's house, so Crystal's mother's house. There, they saw Crystal's 12-year-old daughter, Sarah, sitting almost motionless on the bed, staring at the sunlight that was coming in through the window. After Sarah had been released from the hospital, she'd been sent to stay with her grandmother. Pickett approached Sarah and introduced himself. Then, Pickett very calmly and gently asked Sarah to please tell them what had happened at her house the night before. Sarah took a deep breath and then told the officers that she had been asleep and then heard her mom screaming in the other room. She said she had stayed in her own room until everything went quiet. Then she told the officers about how she found her mom in the kitchen, how she tried to call the police, and then how she ended up running outside and all the way into town to get help. Pickett smiled at Sarah and then asked her if she had maybe caught a glimpse of the person who was with her mother, or if maybe she had recognized this person's voice. Sarah stared at Pickett. She didn't like how he was talking to her, like she was just a little kid. Sarah said she didn't see the other person because she stayed in her room the whole time, and all she had heard was shouting, so she couldn't make out the other person's voice. Pickett smiled again, then he asked her if she liked her mother's boyfriend, Dennis, and was it maybe possible that Sarah knew Dennis had been in their house, but she just didn't want to say that because she wanted to protect him. Sarah glared at Pickett. She was young, but she was smart and observant, and she thought the police wanted her to be an eyewitness who had seen the man who they already believed had killed her mom. But Sarah said she really didn't know who else had been in the house. Pickett thanked Sarah for talking to them, and he and the other officer walked out of the room and headed outside. Pickett did believe Dennis was the most likely culprit, but police would have to wait weeks on DNA test results, and Pickett had no intention of excluding any other leads that might come up between now and those results coming in. Later that day, the investigative team met with more of Crystal's friends and coworkers, and most of them pointed the finger at Dennis too. They knew about his and Crystal's history, and they knew about Dennis's temper. But a few of her friends said there was another man police should look into, Crystal's ex-husband and Sarah's father, Tom Perry. So Pickett began digging into Tom's background right away. He discovered that Crystal had been after Tom to pay the monthly child support that he owed her because he was not giving her the money that the court had ordered him to pay after he and Crystal got divorced. Pickett figured if Crystal had been after Tom for money, that might have been a motive for Tom to attack her. But as Pickett learned about Tom, he started to think there might actually be an even more likely suspect than him, because Pickett found out that Crystal had once filed a restraining order against one of Tom's girlfriends, Joanne Stager. And after speaking to one of Crystal's friends, Pickett learned that in the past few weeks, Joanne had been harassing Crystal. And it turned out that those angry, disturbing phone calls Crystal had been getting at the house were not coming from Dennis like Sarah thought. They had been coming from Joanne, and she had been threatening Crystal. 2 days after Crystal's murder, Detective Pickett and members of his team sat in the living room across from Crystal's ex-husband Tom and his girlfriend Joanne at the house the couple shared. The investigative team still considered Crystal's boyfriend Dennis their primary suspect, but with new information about Tom, and especially about his girlfriend Joanne, they had another promising lead. Pickett looked at the couple sitting on the couch. They were both in their 30s, and they were both tall and had dark hair. And Joanne couldn't seem to stay still for more than a few seconds at a time. Pickett asked Tom about his relationship with Crystal, and when he did, Pickett immediately saw a look of anger come across Joanne's face. But Tom would answer, and he would say that he barely ever talked to Crystal anymore, and he said he totally regretted this, but he didn't really play any meaningful role in his daughter, Sarah's, life. After that, Pickett turned to Joanne and asked her about the restraining order Crystal had filed against her. Joanne kind of laughed, and then she told Pickett a story like she was performing on a stage. She said a couple years earlier she had seen Crystal's red hair from across the dance floor at a club, and she had seen men watching Crystal from all over the place like they always did. But she wasn't angry about that. She was angry because she believed Crystal still had a thing for Tom, and she was tired of Crystal calling the house. So she had marched across the dance floor and confronted Crystal about it. She said Crystal had gotten angry and looked like she was about to start a fight, and so preemptively, Joanne punched her in the face. As Pickett listened to this story, he had trouble believing that anybody other than Joanne had been the cause of that fight. After she was done, Pickett asked her about the angry phone calls, and Joanne said she was just telling Crystal to back off and to leave Tom alone. But Joanne said she would never kill anyone. Finally, Pickett asked where each of them had been at the time of Crystal's murder, and they said they had been together at the house. Pickett knew they could be telling the truth, but each of them being the other's alibi wasn't nearly enough for Pickett to accept their story. So he asked if they would submit DNA samples for testing. Tom and Joanne looked at each other, and then they both looked back at Pickett and said they would be willing to do that. Later that day, Pickett returned to the station. As he looked over his notes from the interviews police had already conducted, he still thought Dennis made the most sense as the suspect. But after meeting with Tom and Joanne, he definitely thought there were other viable suspects. Then, on May 15th, 3 days after Crystal's murder, her friends and family held a small funeral service at a church before Crystal was to be cremated. Sarah stood in the church quietly, and she listened to friends and family talk about her mother and about how much her mom had loved her. And then at some point, Sarah's mother's siblings got up and they said they would get justice for Crystal, whatever it took. And then after the funeral, members of the investigative team heard from one of Crystal's friends that Joanne had been seen popping open champagne and toasting to Crystal's death. And after that, at least some members of the state police started to believe Joanne was just as likely to have killed Crystal as Dennis. In early summer of 1994, weeks after Crystal's murder, results from DNA testing conducted during the investigation started to trickle in, and those results left Detective Pickett and the investigative team in complete shock. The DNA sample from the drop of blood taken from Crystal's leg and other samples taken from her body and around the crime scene did not match the DNA samples provided by Dennis, Tom, or Joanne. Investigators had become so convinced that one of those three people had killed Crystal that they had trouble accepting these DNA results. So they asked for the lab to run the tests again. But when they did, the results were the same. There was no match to any of the main suspects in the case. After that, the authorities ran the DNA test results through something called CODIS, which is a massive FBI database with DNA results from convicted offenders of violent crimes from across the country. And in 1994, the FBI had just started using CODIS to assist police investigations nationwide. So Pickett had high hopes that this new technology would help keep his investigation on track. But the DNA samples taken from Crystal and her house did not match anyone in this massive FBI database. So all of a sudden, this case that had three strong suspects who all had clear motives completely fell apart, and Pickett and his team found themselves having to start all over. But after reassessing the crime scene and conducting a new round of interviews, all of the investigators' theories just felt like pure conjecture. Police followed leads that could possibly connect Crystal's murder to a serial killer who had been caught in the region, but DNA evidence also quickly ruled that out as well. Then, investigators started to look at the possibility that Crystal's murder could have been a robbery gone wrong. Maybe some drug user had broken into her house to steal valuables to sell for drug money, and then of course something had gone wrong and Crystal had wound up dead. After all, drugs were a real issue in Bridgeton, Maine. But a drug addict breaking in, or any robber for that matter, didn't really make sense to Pickett. He and members of the forensics team had always believed the level of violence that had taken place in Crystal's murder indicated it must have been a crime of passion, not some random robbery that just got interrupted. So Pickett soon came to terms with the fact that his investigation had almost nothing to go on. And by the summer of 1995, a year after Crystal's murder, her case was just not a top priority anymore, and it started to go cold. And in May of 1996, 2 years after Crystal's murder, there was still no new information coming in. Crystal's siblings posted a $10,000 reward for anyone who could provide information that would lead to the arrest of the person who had killed their sister, but none of the people who then came forward were able to provide any useful evidence. So another year went by with almost nothing new on the case. Then, not long after that, Detective Pickett retired from the Maine State Police, and people in Bridgeton figured they would never know who had killed Crystal. By that time, Sarah had moved to Texas to live with family members there, and she was doing her best to try to live her life. She thought about her mother constantly, but she had started to distance herself from her friends and family in Maine, as well as the police she had met during the investigation. Years went by without Sarah ever hearing anything new about her mother's murder case, and she grew up, graduated high school, went to college, and then got a job. The little 12-year-old girl who had found her mother murdered in the kitchen and who had run across town in the rain in the middle of the night to get help had now become an adult. And like almost everybody else, Sarah had eventually given up on ever knowing who had killed her mom. In April of 2006, almost 12 years after Crystal's murder, Detective Walter Gerzib of the Maine State Police was sitting in his office. Gerzib had been involved in the investigation into Crystal's murder when he was a young officer, and after Pickett retired, Gerzib had moved up the ranks, and he had remained one of the few investigators who continued to try to find new leads in Crystal's murder case. But that case had remained cold for over a decade. So Gerzib was not hopeful that he or anyone else would ever solve it. Gerzib's phone rang at his desk, so he answered it, and an FBI agent introduced themselves on the other line. And after the two had talked for a few minutes, Gerzib couldn't believe what he was hearing. The FBI agent told him a kidnapper had been caught and convicted in Maine. That kidnapper had submitted a DNA sample, and that sample had been run through the FBI database, and it had matched the blood samples that had been found on Crystal and in her house 12 years earlier. Gurzib hung up the phone in total shock. Soon after the call, Gurzib, other members of the Maine State Police, and FBI agents met with this kidnapper who was in custody. And after that meeting, Gurzib would make a phone call he had been waiting to make for years. He would call Crystal's daughter, Sarah, who was 24 years old at the time, and he would tell her that the police finally knew who had killed her mother. Based on the meeting with the convicted kidnapper, interviews conducted during the investigation, and evidence and DNA samples collected from the crime scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the night somebody murdered Crystal Perry on May 12, 1994. A little before 1 a.m., the killer listened to the sound of their windshield wipers going back and forth while they drove in the rain down a tree-lined road towards Crystal's house. The killer felt their hands tingling. They figured that feeling was the feeling of anticipation because they'd finally gotten up the guts to do something they had wanted to do for a long time. The killer pulled off the road into Crystal's driveway and parked their car behind hers. They turned off the engine, took the keys out of the ignition, and then sat there just listening to the rain and staring at the house for a couple of minutes. Then the killer got out of the car, walked up the driveway, and knocked on the front door. Crystal opened the door just enough to see who was there, and then moments later, she smiled and let the killer in. The killer walked into the house and made their way towards the kitchen, with Crystal following a couple of feet behind. Once the killer reached the kitchen, they stopped, turned around, and looked Crystal in the eye. The killer took a breath and then walked right up to Crystal and put their arms on her arms and then moved in to give her a kiss. But Crystal immediately pushed the killer off and told them to get out of the house. Without thinking, the killer lunged at Crystal, grabbed her, and pulled her onto the ground. Crystal kicked and thrashed, but she could not get free. And so with Crystal pinned down, the killer began to sexually assault her. After it was over, the killer got up off the floor and quickly walked over to a drawer, opened it up, and pulled out a sharp kitchen knife. Crystal saw it and screamed "no" over and over and over again, pulling herself up off the floor and running for the phone. Crystal managed to grab it, but the killer had wheeled around by this point and wrapped their arms around her, and the phone fell to the floor. The killer then threw Crystal back on the floor and pinned her to the ground again. Then the killer raised the knife, and immediately Crystal threw her fists and kicked wildly at the killer, and the killer suddenly felt the knife slice into their own hand, and they saw blood dripping from it. But the killer kept Crystal pinned to the ground, they raised the knife and slammed it into her chest. After that, Crystal stopped fighting, and her body went limp. But the killer just kept on raising that knife and dropping it over and over and over again. In total, the killer would stab Crystal over 50 times. Finally, the killer stopped stabbing and looked around the room. There was blood everywhere, and their boots had left bloody prints on the floor. And the blood from the cut on the killer's hand kept dripping on Crystal's leg. The killer stood up, pocketed the knife, and walked over to the kitchen counter. They grabbed paper towels, knelt down, and started wiping away some of the blood on the floor. But there was just too much, and they had already been in the house for so long, so the killer just held on to the bloody paper towels. They walked back through the house, went outside, and got into their car. They threw the car in reverse, pulled out onto the road, and drove not far down the road to where they lived in town. Michael Hutchinson, the young man with the drug problem, who walked around town all the time high on cocaine, who had gone to high school with Dennis, had murdered Crystal. Michael had never even come up in the investigation because there was really no connection between him and Crystal. It turned out that when Michael came to Crystal's house on the night of the murder, police believe he asked to use her phone because he said he was having car trouble. And Crystal most likely let Michael in because she recognized him as a local and because she was just a nice person. But some members of the police believe Michael was a bit more calculated, that he had probably been one of those men who checked out Crystal from a distance when she was in town or at a bar or on a dance floor, and Michael had wanted her. and so he had shown up to her house, possibly under the influence of alcohol and drugs, and tried to get her to sleep with him. And when Crystal rejected him, Michael went into a blind rage, and he sexually assaulted her and ultimately killed her. And Michael had basically gotten away with it and never even been suspected for years. But then Michael got busted for something totally separate, kidnapping, and he submitted DNA samples and the FBI database got a hit. Michael's new DNA samples matched the passive blood drops taken from Crystal's leg and from her house. Further tests also showed that Michael's semen matched the semen samples taken from Crystal's body. And finally, when investigators met with Michael, they saw a large scar on his hand from a cut that matched the type of knife that was used to kill Crystal. Michael was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As of 2023, Sarah, Crystal's daughter, is a very successful author. She wrote a memoir about her life with her mother before the murder and her life after the murder. The book's dedication page simply reads, "For her." Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of those stories are only available on YouTube, not on this podcast. Again, the YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.